The clay is cold against your fingertips, not the temperature of air-conditioned museum storage, but something older, a fragment no larger than your palm, catalogue number K3473, excavated from the ruins of Nineveh in the 1850s and now resting in a climate-controlled vault beneath the British Museum. The cuneiform wedges pressed into its surface tell a story that should be impossible. They describe how the deepest parts of Earth's oceans came into existence, not through the slow grinding of tectonic plates over millions of years, but through the physical destruction of something vast, a battle so immense that when it ended, the victor tore the loser's body in half and used the pieces to construct the world. The text specifies depths, measurements, locations where primordial waters would settle after violence, reshaped the planet. This is not metaphor presented as metaphor. The Babylonian scribe who pressed these symbols into wet clay 27 centuries ago was copying from earlier sources, preserving what the Sumerians claimed to remember about the formation of the oceans themselves. The tablet describes the moment when Marduk, champion of the younger gods called the Anunnaki, split the body of the primordial ocean goddess Tiamat and arranged her corpse to create the heavens above and the abyss below. One half became the sky, the other half became the deepest waters, what we would now call the ocean trenches, places where the seafloor plunges more than 7 miles beneath the surface. Take a moment, wherever you are listening to this, whether it's late at night or early morning, whether you're at home or travelling, drop a comment and let me know what part of the world you're in. Because what we're about to explore concerns the entire planet, the very shape of its deepest places, and texts that describe their violent origin. The Mariana Trench descends 36,070 feet below sea level. Mount Everest, if placed in the trench, would have more than a mile of water above its peak. Modern geology explains this feature through subduction zones, the Pacific Plate diving beneath the Mariana Plate in a process taking tens of millions of years. But the Sumerians, writing at the dawn of recorded history, described a different origin for such abyssal depths. Their texts speak of primordial waters torn apart by deliberate force, of a cosmic architecture constructed from the remains of a defeated enemy, of the Anunnaki gods who fought to reshape what had been formless chaos into structured creation. The question we'll examine tonight is not whether these texts exist. They do. Dozens of tablets, excavated from multiple sites across Mesopotamia, now housed in museums across 3 continents. The question is what these texts actually claim, and why the Sumerians describe creation in terms of physical destruction, measurable depths, and engineering precision, rather than the abstraction we might expect from ancient mythology. Because when you read the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, preserved on 7 tablets, you encounter something strange. The text functions simultaneously as theology, as political propaganda, elevating Babylon's patron deity, and as something else, a technical account, instructions almost, for how the world's structure came into being through specific actions performed in a specific sequence, the splitting of Tiamat's body, the positioning of her upper half to hold back the celestial waters, the placement of her lower half to form the foundations of the deep ocean, the establishment of the Apsu, the subterranean freshwater abyss beneath the dry land. These are not vague poetic images. The text provides details about who did what and in what order and what resulted from those actions. It describes, in essence, a construction project. The question that has divided scholars for more than a century is whether this represents pure invention, imaginative theology created to explain a world the Sumerians did not yet understand, or whether it represents something stranger, the preservation, however garbled and mythologized, of actual memory. Memory of what, exactly, remains the central mystery, when the skies above were not yet named. Before there was land or sky or the division between salt water and fresh water, the Sumerian texts describe a state that defies easy translation into modern concepts. The opening of the Enuma Elish presents this primordial condition with careful precision, when the skies above were not yet named, nor earth below pronounced by name, when primordial Apsu, their begetter, and Chaos Tiamat, the mother of them all, had mixed their waters together. This is not absence, not void. The texts describe abundance, too much water, undifferentiated and unbound. Two forms of water specifically. Apsu represents the sweet fresh water that flows beneath the earth, the source of springs and rivers and wells. Tiamat embodies the salt water of the sea, bitter and vast and surrounding the known world. In this primordial state, before creation begins, these waters have not yet been separated. They remain mingled, and from their mixing, the first gods emerge. The Sumerian understanding of water differed fundamentally from our modern geological and chemical comprehension. To them, fresh water and salt water were not variations of H2O, but distinct substances with different properties, different divine associations, different purposes in the cosmic order. The Abzu, the Sumerian term that becomes Apsu in Akkadian, represented not merely an aquifer, but a living realm, a place of wisdom, magic, and generative power. Enki, the god of knowledge and crafts, ruled this subterranean ocean. From his temple in the city of Eridu, built directly above what the Sumerians believed was the source point where the Abzu touched the upper world, Enki controlled the springs and groundwater that made agriculture possible. This is documented not in one text, but across multiple independent sources, spanning more than 1,000 years of Mesopotamian civilization. The theology of the Abzu appears in Sumerian temple hymns, in creation accounts, in the administrative records of Eridu's priesthood, in medical incantations that call upon Enki's power over pure water to purify the sick. The consistency is remarkable. The Abzu is always beneath, always fresh water, always associated with order, knowledge, and carefully controlled power. Tiamat, by contrast, represents what cannot be controlled. The texts describe her as vast beyond measuring, powerful beyond containing, and fundamentally hostile to the structured world the younger gods wish to build. In the Enuma Elish, she is not initially malevolent. When Apsu, her consort, complains that the younger gods make too much noise and disturb his rest, it is Apsu who proposes destroying them. Tiamat resists this plan. What? Should we destroy that which we have built? Their ways indeed are most troublesome, but let us attend kindly. Only later, after Ea, the Akkadian name for Enki, learns of Apsu's plan and kills him, does Tiamat turn toward violence. The text is explicit about this sequence. Tiamat must be persuaded to war. Her offspring, angry at Apsu's death, convince her to seek vengeance. She creates monsters to serve as her army: serpents, dragons, storm demons, creatures of primordial chaos. She elevates Chingu, one of her offspring, to lead these forces, and gives him the Tablet of Destinies, an object that grants supreme authority over the cosmos. The war that follows is described across multiple tablets with a level of detail that suggests either literary elaboration or preserved memory of something specific. The gods panic. Anshar, king of the older generation, sends first Ea and then Anu to negotiate with Tiamat. Both return without success, reporting that her rage cannot be appeased. Finally, Marduk, son of Ea, agrees to face her, but only if the other gods grant him permanent supremacy. They convene an assembly, ratify his kingship, and watch as he prepares for combat. The arming of Marduk occupies significant space in the text. He is given weapons both conventional and cosmic: a bow, arrows, a mace, a net fashioned from the four winds, lightning as his weapon, and the storm as his chariot. These details matter because they transform the battle from abstract divine conflict into something more specific. The weaponry suggests storm phenomena, wind, lightning, flooding rain. The description of Tiamat as a water being facing storm weapons creates a scenario where the tools of the victor are precisely calibrated to defeat the nature of the opponent. What happens next has been interpreted by mainstream scholarship as mythological allegory for Babylon's political ascendance over older Mesopotamian city-states. Marduk represents the young dynamic power of Babylon. Tiamat represents the older, more chaotic forces that Babylon sought to control and supersede. The battle symbolises the triumph of order over chaos, of civilized kingship over primordial anarchy. This interpretation is well supported by the text's historical context. The Enuma Elish, in its standard Babylonian version, dates to the late 2nd millennium BC, a period when Babylon was consolidating power and needed theological justification for its supremacy. But the text itself describes something else, something physical. Marduk casts his net. The winds he commands, the 4 winds, the 7 winds, the evil wind, the dust storm, the whirlwind, fill Tiamat's body. She opens her mouth to swallow him, and he sends the winds into her throat, inflating her from within. While she is thus distended, unable to close her mouth, Marduk shoots an arrow that pierces her heart. She dies. Her army flees. Then comes the construction phase. Marduk stands over Tiamat's corpse and divides it like a shellfish into 2 parts. He sets up half of her body as a covering for the heavens, establishing guards to prevent her waters from escaping. The other half he uses to form the foundations below. He measures out the Apsu, the realm that had been Ea's domain, and above it constructs a replica, a cosmic architecture of corresponding layers. The text states this explicitly. He divided the monstrous shape and created marvels from it. He split her open like a muscle into 2 parts. Half of her he set in place and formed the sky therewith as a roof. This is engineering language: division, measurement, positioning, foundation setting. The Akkadian verbs used in these passages denote physical manipulation, not metaphorical transformation. The text describes Marduk arranging celestial bodies to mark time, appointing gods to their proper stations, and organising the structure of heaven and earth with mathematical precision. 300 Anunnaki are stationed in heaven, 300 on earth, 600 in total. The numbers are specific, administrative, almost bureaucratic. At the deepest level, beneath the constructed order, the text places the remnants of what was destroyed. Tiamat's lower half becomes the foundation for the ocean depths. The Apsu, which Ea claimed by killing Apsu the god, remains as the freshwater abyss beneath. These layers, Apsu below, ocean depths above it, dry land above that, and sky highest of all, create a cosmos structured vertically, with the deepest places representing the oldest forces, barely contained by the architecture built upon their defeat. The Sumerian worldview, inherited and expanded by the Babylonians, understood creation not as something made from nothing, but as the ordering of something pre-existing and dangerous. Water came first. Water was chaos. Water had to be divided, constrained, allocated to proper realms. The deepest waters, the ocean trenches, in modern terms, represented the parts of Tiamat's body that could not be eliminated, only buried beneath layers of subsequent creation. This raises a question that scholars have debated for generations. Why water? Why structure creation around the division and control of oceans? Mesopotamia is not an oceanic culture. The Sumerians and Babylonians built their civilization along rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, not coastlines. The Persian Gulf lies to the south, but Mesopotamian texts consistently describe the ocean as distant, mysterious, and marginal to human affairs. The Epic of Gilgamesh travels to the ocean only when seeking the immortal Utnapishtim, who lives beyond the boundaries of the normal world. The ocean is where the familiar ends, yet the creation stories place water at the absolute beginning. Not earth or light or life, but water in its two forms, mingled and waiting to be separated. Some scholars argue this reflects Mesopotamia's dependence on water management. Irrigation agriculture requires careful control of river flooding, distinction between potable and non-potable water, engineering to direct water where it is needed and drain it where it is not. The cosmic battle between Marduk and Tiamat thus becomes an allegory for human mastery over the environment, the imposition of agricultural order on natural chaos. This interpretation is reasonable and well evidenced. The Sumerians were master hydraulic engineers. Archaeological excavations reveal sophisticated canal systems, regulated flood basins, and water lifting technologies that allowed civilization to flourish in a region of extreme seasonal variation. The cosmic drama might simply reflect back what the Sumerians achieved every year on a smaller scale, the control and direction of potentially destructive water. But the texts describe more than control. They describe depths, measurements, places where water goes down beyond human reach, into regions associated with the dead, with forbidden knowledge, with powers that predate the current order. The Abzu is not a shallow aquifer. In Sumerian cosmology, it is bottomless. The ocean where Tiamat's remnants lie is not the Persian Gulf, but something vaster and deeper, surrounding the entire disk of the world. The texts seem to remember or imagine places where water descends beyond light, beyond life, into abyssal realms that connect to the moment of creation itself. Whether this represents pure invention or contains some kernel of preserved knowledge remains unclear. What is clear is that the Sumerians, at the very beginning of written history, described the ocean depths as a wound in the world, a place where primordial violence left its mark, a scar that goes all the way down, the Anunnaki before the war. The term Anunnaki appears hundreds of times across the Sumerian and Akkadian textual corpus. It is not a vague designation, but a specific category within the divine hierarchy. The Anunnaki are the children of An, the sky god, and Ki, the earth. In some texts they number 50, in others 300, in still others 600. This numerical flexibility suggests the term functioned more as a class designation, the collective of younger gods, rather than a fixed roster of specific deities. What remains consistent across the texts is the Anunnaki's role before the creation of humanity. They work, they labour, they perform the tasks necessary to maintain the cosmos, and they grow weary of this burden. The Atrahasis epic, preserved on tablets dating to the Old Babylonian period around 1800 BCE, describes this situation most clearly. The opening section, significantly damaged but partially reconstructed from multiple manuscript sources, explains that when the gods first divided the universe, the senior deities Anu, Enlil and Ea took dominion over sky, earth and waters respectively. The Anunnaki, the younger generation, received the task of labour. The text specifies what this labour entailed: digging rivers, clearing channels, excavating irrigation works. For 40 years, the text states, the Anunnaki dug the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. 40 years is a suspiciously specific number. It suggests either literary convention or the preservation of a tradition that attributed the major waterworks of Mesopotamia to a prolonged project. But more important than the duration is the nature of the complaint. The Anunnaki grow exhausted. The text describes their physical suffering. The Anunnaki were groaning, complaining, grumbling in the excavations. This is too much, they said. We are burdened with toil, our work is heavy, the distress enormous. This is not divine whimsy. The text presents the Anunnaki's complaint in terms immediately recognizable to anyone who has performed sustained manual labour. The work is too heavy, the burden too great, the duration too long without relief. The gods decide to strike. They burn their tools, march on Enlil's temple in the middle of the night and demand redress. Enlil, the text records, is frightened. He sends for Anu and Ea. Together, the three senior gods hold council. The solution proposed by Ea is radical. Create a new category of being to bear the labour burden the Anunnaki can no longer sustain. This new creature will be called Lulu, the word that becomes humanity in later Akkadian. Humans will be fashioned from clay and the blood of a slain god, specifically the god who led the Anunnaki rebellion. His name varies across manuscript traditions. In some versions, he is Geshtu-E. In others, Waila. His intelligence will be mixed with clay to create beings capable of understanding and performing the tasks formerly assigned to the Anunnaki. The creation of humanity in the Atrahasis thus occurs as a direct solution to divine labour exhaustion. Humans exist to work in place of gods. This theology has profound implications for Mesopotamian society, creating a cosmic justification for human servitude and positioning kings as managers of the divine work force on earth. But for our purposes, what matters is the state of affairs before humans exist. The Anunnaki are labourers. They dig, they excavate, they reshape the landscape through sustained, exhausting physical effort. This portrait of the Anunnaki as workers appears elsewhere in the textual tradition. In the Sumerian composition Enki and Ninmah, which describes an alternate creation account, the gods complain to Nama, the primordial mother. The gods are having to work and are complaining about it. The gods are burdened with toil. Nama proposes that Enki fashion a substitute worker from the clay of the Absu. Enki does so with Ninmah's assistance, creating multiple versions before achieving a successful human prototype. Both accounts agree on the fundamental problem: gods should not have to labour, but before humanity they do. The world requires maintenance. Rivers must be dug, channels cleared, boundaries established and maintained. These are not metaphorical activities, but descriptions of the literal hydraulic engineering that made Mesopotamian civilization possible. Yet the texts also describe another form of divine labour, the work of creation itself, of organising chaos into cosmos. This appears most clearly in the period before the battle with Tiamat. The younger gods, not yet organised under Marduk's kingship, exist in a state of potential but not yet actualised power. They are numerous, they are noisy, they disturb the primordial waters simply by existing in proximity to them. Apsu finds their activity intolerable. Their ways have become painful to me. By day I cannot rest, by night I cannot sleep. I will abolish their ways and disperse them. Let there be silence, and let us sleep. This complaint reveals something important about the pre-creation state. The younger gods are not yet productive. They have not yet been assigned tasks. They simply exist, and their existence itself creates disturbance. It is only after Ea kills Apsu and Marduk defeats Tiamat that the divine order stabilizes. Marduk assigns the Anunnaki to their stations, 300 in heaven, 300 on earth, giving them specific roles in maintaining cosmic function. Before this organisation, they are potential energy waiting for direction. The battle with Tiamat thus serves multiple functions in the mythological structure. It establishes Marduk's supremacy over the divine assembly. It creates the physical structure of heaven and earth from Tiamat's divided body, and it organises the Anunnaki into a functioning hierarchy with assigned responsibilities. Before the battle, they are chaotic. After, they are ordered. This transition from chaos to order through violence appears across multiple mythological systems in the ancient Near East. The Canaanite god Baal defeats Yam, the sea god, and establishes his kingship. The Egyptian god Ra battles Apep, the serpent of chaos, every night to ensure the sun rises. The Greek Zeus overthrows the Titans in a cosmic war before establishing Olympian rule. The pattern repeats. An older, more chaotic divine generation must be defeated before the younger gods can create a stable cosmos. But the Mesopotamian version adds a specific detail not always present in parallel myths. The defeated chaos being becomes the raw material of creation. Tiamat is not banished to Tartarus like the Greek Titans, or imprisoned beneath mountains like the Canaanite Yam. She is divided and used. Her body becomes the architecture of the universe. This transforms her from antagonist into foundation, from obstacle into infrastructure. The Anunnaki, having stood with Marduk against Tiamat, inherit this constructed world. The Enuma Elish describes their celebration after Marduk's victory. They build him a temple, Esagila, in Babylon as a reward. They gather in assembly and proclaim his 50 names, each representing an aspect of his supreme power. They acknowledge that he has done what they collectively could not, defeat the primordial chaos and establish stable order. But underneath that order, the text suggests, the chaos remains. Tiamat is not destroyed, but divided and repositioned. Her waters still exist, now constrained by the cosmic architecture Marduk imposed. The Anunnaki labour to maintain this structure, not to create it ex nihilo, but to prevent reversion to the primordial state. Their work, after the battle, consists of holding boundaries, preventing the celestial waters from breaking through the firmament, keeping the abyssal waters confined to their proper depths. This is documented in later texts that describe divine maintenance work. The Anunnaki open and close the gates of heaven to regulate rainfall. They patrol the boundaries between the living world and the underworld. They ensure the sun, moon and stars follow their appointed paths. This is not spontaneous natural order, but engineered order requiring continuous oversight. The implication is troubling. If the world requires constant divine labour to prevent chaos from reasserting itself, then the victory over Tiamat is not final, but provisional. The depth where her remnants lie, the abyssal ocean trenches, represent not dead ruins, but suppressed potential. The deepest waters remember what they were before division and constraint. They wait beneath the weight of imposed order, perhaps not permanently defeated, but only temporarily contained. The Anunnaki, standing guard over these depths, would know this better than any other gods. They built the structure, they maintain it. They remember what lies beneath, the body that became the world. Tablet 4 of the Enuma Elish describes the battle itself. The text oscillates between cosmic abstraction and oddly specific physical detail, creating a narrative that functions simultaneously as mythology and as something stranger, almost like engineering documentation disguised as theological poetry. Marduk and Tiamat meet. The text describes them surveying each other, advancing toward the fight. Tiamat's champion, Chingu, who carries the Tablet of Destinies, stands ready but does not engage directly. The confrontation focuses entirely on Marduk and Tiamat. She speaks first, challenging him, "Why are your intentions hostile to me? The gods, your fathers, have risen up, and now they too are standing with you." This accusation reveals something about the battle's context. Tiamat understands herself as fighting not just Marduk, but the collective will of the younger gods who elevated him. Her complaint is about betrayal, about offspring who chose order over primordial freedom. Marduk does not argue, he responds with action. The weapons he deploys are significant. The text names them the winds, plural and specific, the Imhullu, the evil wind, the Abubu, the storm wind, the Ishatu, the dust storm. 7 winds in total, each described as having distinct properties. Modern readers might interpret these as literary multiplication, taking the basic concept of wind and elaborating variations for poetic effect. But Mesopotamian texts elsewhere demonstrate detailed taxonomies of natural phenomena. They distinguished rain types, star patterns, plant species, medical symptoms. When the text names 7 different winds, it may reflect genuine observation of weather patterns in Mesopotamia, where different wind types bring different effects: drought, sandstorms, cooling relief, destructive gales. Marduk directs these winds into Tiamat's body. The mechanism is precise. She opens her mouth to speak, to swallow, to attack. In that moment of openness, Marduk sends the winds inside her. The text states, when Tiamat opened her mouth to devour him, he drove in the evil wind so that she could not close her lips. The fierce winds charged her belly, her body was distended, and her mouth was wide open. This is not vague poetic imagery. The text describes inflation. Tiamat's body fills with wind pressure, distends beyond its normal boundaries, cannot contract. She becomes, in essence, a pressurized vessel unable to release its internal force. While she is in this immobilized state, Marduk shoots an arrow through her open mouth. The arrow pierces her heart. She dies. What follows is the division. Marduk stands over the corpse and splits it. The Akkadian verb used is alu, meaning to divide into 3 parts, or more generally to split. The text specifies the implement. Marduk uses a weapon or tool to open Tiamat like a shellfish into 2 parts. The comparison to opening a shellfish is deliberate and specific. Anyone who has shucked oysters or clams understands the action: finding the hinge point, applying force to separate the 2 halves, exposing the interior. Marduk performs this action on a cosmic scale. He separates Tiamat's body into upper and lower halves. The upper half he positions as the ceiling of heaven, establishing a bolt. He stationed guards. He commanded them not to let her waters escape. This creates the firmament of ancient Near Eastern cosmology, a solid barrier separating the celestial ocean above from the habitable world below. The guards mentioned are presumably celestial beings whose job is to prevent the waters above the firmament from breaking through and flooding the earth below. This same cosmological model appears in Genesis 1, where God separates the waters above from the waters below by creating a firmament between them. The lower half of Tiamat's body receives different treatment. Marduk set up the lower half of her body, forming the earth, but not simply as land. The text describes multiple layers beneath the visible surface. First comes the establishment of the Apsu, specifically mentioned as being measured out and positioned beneath the earth. Above the Apsu, Marduk constructs his own dwelling, Ishara, and above that comes the surface world, where humans will eventually live. The text language here is architectural. Marduk measures, establishes, positions, founds. These are builders' verbs. The creation of the cosmos emerges not through speech alone, though Marduk does speak commands, but through physical manipulation of defeated matter. The universe has a body at its foundation. That body is Tiamat's. This raises a question scholars have long debated. What does it mean for the world to be built from a corpse? In purely theological terms, it establishes divine supremacy through violence. The old order must die for the new order to emerge. Chaos must be killed so that cosmos can exist. This interpretation aligns with political readings of the text. Babylon's supremacy requires the defeat of older power centres, mythologically encoded as Tiamat's death. But the text also seems concerned with explaining physical structure. Why is the sky above? Because Tiamat's upper half was placed there. Why are there waters above the sky? Because that portion of Tiamat's body still retains its watery nature. Why does the earth rest on a foundation of subterranean waters? Because Tiamat's lower half was positioned there, and the Apsu already existed beneath. The cosmology creates a layered universe. Celestial waters, upper body of Tiamat. Firmament, the bolt that contains those waters. Air and clouds. Surface earth. Underground waters / Apsu, tower body of Tiamat. Underworld, still. Each layer has a function. The celestial waters above provide rain when the gates are opened. The surface earth provides living space for humans and animals. The underground waters feed springs and wells. The underworld houses the dead. But all of this structure derives from an act of division, of taking something unified and separating it into constituent parts, each assigned a specific role. The question becomes, why did this particular cosmological model appeal to Mesopotamian theologians? Other cultures imagined different structures. The Egyptians pictured the sky as a goddess, Nut, arching over the earth god, Geb, with air separating them. The Greeks eventually developed models of celestial spheres rotating around a central earth. The Norse imagined a world tree, Yggdrasil, connecting different realms vertically. Each model reflects something about how those cultures experienced and interpreted their environment. Mesopotamia's model emphasizes containment and constraint. Waters above and below must be kept separate from the habitable middle zone. Boundaries must be maintained. Gods must actively prevent reversion to the primordial mixed state. This perhaps reflects Mesopotamian environmental experience, a land constantly threatened by both flood and drought, where water management meant the difference between abundance and catastrophe. The cosmic architecture mirrors the irrigation infrastructure, channels, dikes, gates, controlled release and containment. But the text describes something more than metaphorical irrigation on a cosmic scale. They describe depths, specifically places where the primordial waters still exist in something close to their original state. The Apsu beneath the earth is described as vast and deep beyond measuring. When humans die, some texts place their shades in this region, suggesting it is imagined as the lowest accessible realm. Below even that, the texts sometimes reference even darker depths, places where not just human shades, but primordial monsters and defeated gods are imprisoned. Tiamat's lower body becomes all of this, the foundation of the earth, the source of the Apsu, and by extension the deepest places where water descends beyond light and life. In modern geological terms, we might map this onto Earth's actual structure. The ocean trenches, the abyssal plains, the Hadal zones, where pressure becomes crushing and life sparse. These are the deepest points on the planet's surface, reaching down more than 7 miles below sea level. The Sumerians and Babylonians did not know these trenches existed in the specific form we now measure them. They had no way to sound the depths of the open ocean, but they knew about depth. They dug wells and found water at different levels. They knew that some springs emerged from profound sources. They understood that water could descend into the earth and travel underground through passages they could not see. Their cosmology of layered depths reflected this empirical knowledge, extended to cosmic scale. What remains puzzling is the specificity with which the texts describe the division of Tiamat's body. The measurements, the positioning, the assignment of portions to different functions, all of this suggests more than poetic invention. It reads like a blueprint. Instructions for how the world was assembled and, by implication, how it must be maintained. If the Enuma Elish functions as cosmic architecture documentation, then Tiamat's body is not just a mythological conceit, but a way of thinking about planetary structure. The depths where her lower portions lie would represent the deepest, oldest, most fundamental layers of reality, places where the primordial state still exists, however contained and constrained, places that remember what existed before order was imposed. The Mariana Trench, the Tonga Trench, the Philippine Trench, these names would mean nothing to a Babylonian scribe. But the concept of profound depth, of places where ocean descends beyond imagining into primal darkness, that concept exists in the texts. Whether they imagine such places correctly, whether their cosmology bears any relationship to actual planetary structure, remains an open question. What is not questionable is that they thought about these depths seriously, incorporated them into their creation narratives, and attributed them to the moment of cosmic violence, when the primordial chaos was torn apart and reorganized into the world as they knew it. Tiamat's body becomes the world. Her death creates the space for life, but she is not destroyed, only divided and repositioned. The deepest parts of her remain down in the abyss, beneath layers of subsequent creation, waiting in cold and pressure and darkness. What the depths remember. The Sumerian word Abzu appears in cuneiform as a combination of two signs, Ab and Zu, deep/far/wise. Together they create a term that means simultaneously deep water, primordial ocean, and source of wisdom. This conflation is not accidental. In Sumerian thought, depth and knowledge are connected. The deeper one descends into the Abzu, the closer one comes to foundational truth, the patterns that existed before creation, the knowledge that predates the current cosmic order. Enki, who rules the Abzu, is the god of wisdom, magic and crafts. His dominion is not the surface waters of rivers and canals, but the vast underground ocean that Mesopotamian cosmology places beneath the earth. Enki's temple at Eridu, the E-Abzu of the Abzu, was believed to sit directly above the point where this subterranean ocean came closest to the surface. The temple's inner sanctum contained a pool of water replenished by springs, understood to be a direct connection to Enki's realm below. Archaeological excavations at Eridu, conducted in the 1940s by Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd, revealed a sequence of temples built atop one another, extending back to the Ubaid period around 5000 BCE. The earliest structures already demonstrate religious significance, built platforms, offerings, careful architectural planning. The site's continuity of sacred function across more than 3,000 years suggests that whatever made Eridu special to the Sumerians was present from the beginning. The standard archaeological interpretation holds that the site's access to fresh water in an otherwise arid region made it naturally sacred. Springs meant life, and life meant divine presence. But the texts describe something more specific than general water sanctity. They describe the Abzu as a realm beneath the earth, connected to surface water sources but not identical to them, a vast ocean, dark and deep, containing not just water but knowledge, power, and the remnants of primordial creation. Enki descends into this realm and retrieves from it the Me, the fundamental elements of civilization and cosmic order. These Me include kingship, priesthood, truth, metalworking, agriculture, sexual intercourse, warfare, and dozens of other concepts. They exist, the texts suggest, prior to their manifestation in the upper world. Enki brings them up from the depths and distributes them to cities and institutions. This creates a cosmological structure where the deep contains what the surface merely manifests. The Abzu is not absence, but presence, the source code of reality itself, preserved in the dark waters beneath. The connection between depth and memory appears explicitly in flood narratives. When the gods decide to destroy humanity, they do so by breaching the boundaries between the Abzu below and the celestial waters above. The flood in the Epic of Gilgamesh describes this precisely. The Anunnaki raised their torches, lighting the land with their radiance. The stillness of the storm God passed over the sky, and all that was bright turned to darkness. The gods were frightened by the deluge and retreated up to the heaven of Anu. The gods cowered like dogs crouched against the outer wall. The mechanics of this flood are cosmological. It is not simple rain. The text describes the simultaneous opening of multiple water sources. The sky opens. The deep opens. Water ascends from below and descends from above, meeting in the middle and drowning the habitable world between them. This is the deliberate undoing of creation, a temporary reversion to the primordial state where waters mingle undifferentiated. Only when the flood subsides do the boundaries reassert themselves, the Abzu returning to its proper depth and the celestial waters withdrawing to their proper height. After the flood, the survivor Utnapishtim, or Ziusudra in earlier Sumerian versions, Atrahasis in Akkadian variants, is granted immortality and placed at the mouth of the rivers, a liminal location at the edge of the known world where fresh water meets salt water. This placement is significant. Utnapishtim becomes a guardian of memory, living at the boundary between the ordered world and the primordial ocean. When Gilgamesh seeks him out to learn the secret of immortality, Gilgamesh must cross these waters, a journey that requires special assistance from divine or semi-divine beings because mortals cannot navigate such depths. The flood narratives preserve a crucial detail: the deep remembers. When the waters recede, they do not simply vanish, but return to their appointed places, the Abzu below, the celestial ocean above. What was revealed during the flood, the potential for boundaries to dissolve and chaos to reassert itself, remains true even after order is restored. The depths contain the possibility of return to the primordial state. They are not inert geology, but living potential, held in place by divine architecture that requires constant maintenance. This understanding appears in multiple Sumerian texts that describe cosmic maintenance work. The Anunnaki are depicted as labourers who shore up boundaries, reinforce cosmic structures, and prevent the breakthrough of chaos. Their work is never finished, because the underlying reality never becomes fully stable. Creation is not a completed event, but an ongoing process of containment and constraint. Modern geology provides an interesting parallel. Ocean trenches are not static features. They are subduction zones where one tectonic plate descends beneath another, generating earthquakes, volcanic activity, and constant geological transformation. The deepest parts of the ocean are also the most dynamically active, places where Earth's interior forces interact with surface processes. In a sense, these depths are where the planet's foundational processes remain visible, where the primordial heat and pressure from Earth's formation continue to shape the surface. The Sumerians could not have known about plate tectonics or subduction zones, but they lived in a geologically active region. Earthquakes were familiar, seasonal flooding was predictable, but also destructive. The Tigris and Euphrates shifted course, destroying cities and creating new ones. The environment demonstrated instability, the potential for sudden catastrophic change beneath apparently stable conditions. Their cosmology mirrors this experience. The depths are not safe or inert. They contain forces barely held in check. The Abzu is the realm of Enki, god of controlled magic and beneficial crafts, but it is also adjacent to the underworld, realm of the dead and of dangerous powers. The boundary between them is maintained but permeable. Some texts describe tunnels or passages connecting the Abzu to the underworld, allowing movement between realms for those who know the way. What lies at the absolute bottom, the texts do not specify. Some passages suggest Tiamat's remnants are there, the portions of her body that could not be integrated into useful cosmic architecture. Other texts place defeated monsters in the deep, the creatures Tiamat created to fight Marduk, imprisoned after the battle rather than destroyed. Still other passages describe the deep as simply extending downward without limit, beyond the reach of human or even divine knowledge. This infinite regression is intellectually troubling. If the Abzu is truly bottomless, then the cosmic architecture lacks a foundation. It rests on nothing, or rather on water that extends forever downward. The stability of the upper world depends on the containment of something that has no end. This creates perpetual vulnerability. At any moment, the architecture could fail, and the depths rise to reclaim the surface. The Mesopotamian response to this vulnerability is not to deny it, but to ritualize its management. Temple rituals include purification with water brought from sacred springs, water understood to come from the Abzu. Incantations call upon Enki and the Abzu's power to heal illness, reverse curses, and restore order. The New Year festival in Babylon, the Akitu, ritually reenacts the battle between Marduk and Tiamat, reminding participants that cosmic order derives from a victory that must be continuously reaffirmed. These rituals acknowledge what the myths state explicitly: creation is precarious, The deep remembers the primordial chaos. It waits beneath the surface. And periodically, through floods, through earthquakes, through cosmic dissolution, it reminds the surface world that the battle was won, but not permanently concluded. Whether the Sumerians imagined this correctly is less important than recognizing what they were attempting to explain. They lived in an unstable environment. They built civilization through irrigation and water management in a region of extreme climate. They knew that water, uncontrolled, destroys. They knew that depth is dangerous. They incorporated this knowledge into cosmology, creating myths that explain the physical structure of their world while simultaneously warning about its fundamental instability. The deepest oceans in their cosmology are not empty abysses, but the residue of creation's violent origin. They are where primordial matter still exists, constrained but not eliminated, held in place by architecture that requires eternal vigilance to maintain. The depths remember what the surface tries to forget, that chaos predates order, that water came before land, and that the division between them is an imposed structure, not an eternal given. Down in the dark, beneath miles of pressure, in cold beyond tolerance, the primordial waits. The tablets that survived the flood. The tablet catalogue, number CBS 10673, housed in the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, contains the oldest Sumerian version of the flood story. Excavated from Nippur during the 1898 expedition, the tablet dates to approximately 1600 B, but preserves a composition likely much older. The text is fragmentary, roughly one-third survives, but what remains describes the same essential narrative found in later Akkadian versions. The gods decide to destroy humanity with a flood, one god warns a pious man, the man builds a boat, the flood comes and destroys civilization. The waters recede, the survivor performs sacrifices, and the gods grant him special status. The Sumerian version names the hero Ziusudra. The Akkadian versions name him Atrahasis or Utnapishtim. The biblical version calls him Noah. Despite the variation in names and specific details, the core narrative remains consistent across centuries and linguistic shifts, evidence of a tradition so deeply embedded in Mesopotamian cultural memory that it survived translation, political upheaval, and religious transformation. What differs between versions is not the event itself, but its framing. The earliest Sumerian texts present the flood almost matter-of-factly as something that happened at a specific point in the past. The Weld-Blundell prism, UL 444, which contains the most complete copy of the Sumerian king list, divides its narrative cleanly: kings before the flood, flood, kings after the flood. The text states, the flood swept over. After the flood had swept over and the kingship had descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. This is historical language, not mythological. The king list treats the flood as a chronological marker dividing pre-flood civilization from post-flood civilization. The kings who ruled before the flood are given reign lengths that span tens of thousands of years, numbers clearly either symbolic or indicating a different understanding of time measurement. But they are listed as historical rulers, assigned to specific cities: Eridu, Bad Tabira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak. After the flood, the reign lengths drop to more believable numbers, hundreds of years rather than tens of thousands, and the sequence of dynasties proceeds through cities attested in archaeological records. The division creates a periodization, antediluvian history, and post-flood history. Everything before the flood partakes of a different temporal quality, a mythic time when gods and humans interacted more directly and human lifespan extended far beyond later norms. Everything after the flood exists in historical time, subject to the same limitations and patterns observable in the present. But the Sumerian king list makes a crucial claim. Kingship existed before the flood. Civilization existed before the flood. Cities existed before the flood. The flood did not mark the beginning of human society, but a catastrophic rupture within it. What came after was not new, but restored, rebuilt on the ruins of what had been destroyed. This framing appears across multiple independent Mesopotamian sources. The Eridu Genesis, preserved on CBS 1673, describes the gods' decision to create cities and distribute kingship to them. The text specifies that 5 cities were established before the flood: Eridu, Bad Tibera, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak. Each received divine oversight. Each had rulers. The text describes this period as functional and ordered, not chaotic or primitive. Then, with little explanation, the text breaks. The flood was sent. After the flood had swept over, when kingship was lowered from heaven, kingship was in Kish. The gap between these statements contains the catastrophe. CBS 1673 is too damaged to preserve the complete narrative, but other versions fill the absence. The gods decide. The text does not explain why, suggesting the reason was understood to be known: to destroy humanity. Enki breaks ranks and warns Ziusudra, instructing him to build a boat with specific dimensions. The flood comes. 7 days and nights of rain. The text emphasizes duration and totality, all the windstorms, exceedingly powerful, attacked as one, and at the same time the flood swept over the cult centers. The phrase cult centers is significant. The Sumerian term is Ki-Engi, which can mean land of Sumer, but more literally means place of the empresshood. The flood does not destroy random settlements, but specifically targets places of religious authority, centers where divine human interaction was formalized. This creates a different disaster than simple environmental catastrophe. The flood destroys the infrastructure of cosmic order, the temples, the priesthoods, the ritual systems that maintained proper relationship between heaven and earth. After the waters recede, Ziusudra emerges and performs sacrifice. The gods, smelling the sweet savour, gather around. Some versions describe them as hungry, having been deprived of offerings during the flood. Others emphasize their regret, particularly Enlil's anger that any humans survived despite his decree. But Enki defends his action, arguing that total destruction was excessive. A compromise is reached. Humanity will be allowed to continue, but with limitations, shorter lifespans, more difficult living conditions, and eternal subjection to divine will. Ziusudra receives immortality and is placed at the mouth of the rivers, outside ordinary human geography. The text emphasizes his special status. He is removed from history, placed in a liminal zone where he can neither affect nor be affected by subsequent human affairs. His immortality is not a blessing, but a boundary. He becomes a marker of the transition between antediluvian and post-flood eras, living proof that the old world existed, but remaining forever inaccessible to the new world's inhabitants. The Akkadian versions elaborate these themes. The Atrahasis epic provides the most detailed account of the god's motivation. Humanity has grown too numerous and noisy. Enlil cannot sleep. He proposes first plague, then drought, then finally flood as solutions to human overpopulation. Each time, Enki intervenes to teach humans how to appease the gods and survive. Finally, Enlil decrees the flood as a final solution, binding all gods to secrecy. Enki circumvents the oath by speaking to the reed wall of Atrahasis' house rather than directly to the man, technically preserving the letter of his vow while betraying its spirit. The Gilgamesh version, preserved on tablet C, number K, 3375 from the British Museum's Assyrian collection, presents the flood as Utnapishtim's story told to Gilgamesh. This creates a narrative frame where flood memory is explicitly positioned as ancient history, something from a distant past accessible only through the testimony of one who lived through it. Utnapishtim describes the flood's coming, the loading of animals and craftspeople onto the boat, the storm's fury, and its aftermath. His description emphasizes sensory detail. The storm raged for 6 days and 6 nights. On the 7th day the flood ceased, which had warred like an army. The sea calmed, the tempest stilled, the flood ceased. When Utnapishtim emerges, he sees only destruction. I looked upon the world, there was silence. All humanity had returned to clay. The phrase is precise and terrible. Not died, but returned to clay, reverted to the raw material from which, according to Mesopotamian creation accounts, humans were originally fashioned. The flood is thus uncreation, a reversal of the order established at the world's beginning. But the world is rebuilt. Kingship descends again from heaven. New cities are founded. Civilization resumes. The question this narrative pattern raises is whether the second creation differs fundamentally from the first or simply repeats it. Are post-flood humans different beings than their antediluvian predecessors? Is post-flood civilization a pale imitation of what existed before, or an improvement, or simply an iteration of an eternal pattern? The texts do not provide a unified answer. Some suggest diminishment. Antediluvian humans lived longer and possessed greater wisdom. Others suggest continuity, the same institutions, the same relationship with the gods, simply relocated to new cities after the old were destroyed. Still others imply cyclical repetition, that floods happen periodically, destroying and renewing civilization in an eternal return. What remains consistent is the treatment of the flood as a historical marker. It happened. Before it came one era, after it came another. Memory of pre-flood civilization survived because one man and his family survived, carrying forward the knowledge and practices that would reseed the destroyed world. Modern archaeology has searched for evidence of a historical flood that might correspond to these narratives. Excavations at various Mesopotamian sites have revealed flood deposits, layers of silt-interrupting sequences of occupation. Leonard Woolley's excavations at Ur in the 1920s uncovered an 8-foot layer of clean water-laid clay, which he initially identified as evidence of the biblical flood. Subsequent analysis demonstrated that different sites show flood deposits at different chronological levels, suggesting multiple local floods rather than a single universal catastrophe. Max Mallowan's work at Nineveh in the 1930s and 1940s also found flood deposits, but again at levels that did not correlate with those found at Ur. The consensus among modern archaeologists is that Mesopotamia experienced numerous severe floods over its history. The Tigris and Euphrates are prone to catastrophic flooding, and the flat alluvial plain provides little natural protection. Any one of these floods could have been locally devastating enough to seem universal to its survivors. The narrative tradition preserved the memory not of a single flood, but of flooding as a recurring existential threat. But the Mesopotamian texts do not describe recurring floods. They describe the flood, singular and unprecedented. After it, kingship must be re-established, because the previous order was completely destroyed. The 5 antediluvian cities are abandoned. Post-flood civilization begins in Kish, a different location. This suggests the flood in Mesopotamian memory represents not routine seasonal flooding, but a catastrophe of civilizational scale. Whether such an event actually occurred, a flood so massive it destroyed multiple cities and killed most of the population, leaving only isolated survivors to rebuild, remains historically uncertain. What is certain is that Mesopotamian culture treated it as foundational. The division between before and after the flood structures their understanding of history. Everything ancient traces back to the antediluvian period. Everything contemporary exists in the shadow of that catastrophe. The tablets that survived contain this memory. CBS 1673, WB444, the Atrahasis manuscripts, Gilgamesh Shi, These artefacts preserve a tradition of discontinuity, of a rupture in time that divided human experience into irreconcilable before and after. The flood destroyed not just cities and people, but the connection to primordial time, to the age when gods and humans interacted directly, when lifespans extended for millennia, when the first wisdom was established. After the flood, that wisdom must be reconstructed from memory, from the testimony of the one family who survived, from the tablets that somehow endured the deluge. Mesopotamian scribes copied these texts for centuries, preserving across political collapse and linguistic change the record of the catastrophe that nearly ended everything. The fact that we can read these accounts today, 3,000 years after they were written, testifies to the success of that preservation effort. The flood came, civilization drowned, but memories survived, the scars in the earth. The Mariana Trench reaches a maximum depth of 36,070 feet below sea level at a point called Challenger Deep, measured by modern sonar and confirmed by manned submersible expeditions. This is deeper than Mount Everest is tall. If you placed Everest at the bottom of the trench, its peak would still be covered by more than a mile of water. The pressure at Challenger Deep exceeds 15,000 pounds per square inch, more than 1,000 times atmospheric pressure at sea level. At this pressure, human lungs would collapse instantly, bones would fracture, and death would occur faster than the brain could process pain. This trench, and others like it, formed through subduction, the process where one tectonic plate slides beneath another. The Pacific plate, moving westward, collides with the smaller Mariana plate and is forced downward into Earth's mantle. This process occurs continuously over millions of years, generating earthquakes, triggering volcanic activity in the island arc above the subduction zone, and creating the deepest topographic features on the planet's surface. Modern geology explains ocean trenches through plate tectonics, a theory developed in the 1960s that revolutionized understanding of Earth's structure. The planet's outer shell consists of rigid plates floating on the semi-molten mantle beneath. These plates move at rates measured in centimetres per year, slow by human standards, but sufficient over geological time to reshape continents and oceans entirely. Where plates collide, the denser plate subducts beneath the lighter one, creating trenches at the point of descent. This process has nothing to do with divine battles or the division of primordial goddesses. It represents the mechanical behaviour of rock under heat and pressure over millions of years. The deepest trenches, Mariana, Tonga, Philippine, Kermadec, Kuril-Kamchatka, all form at subduction zones ringing the Pacific Ocean. Their formation is ongoing. Every year, the Pacific plate descends slightly deeper beneath the surrounding plates, and the trenches deepen by imperceptible increments. Yet the Sumerian texts describe depths. The Abzu extends downward beyond measurement. Tiamat's lower body forms the foundations of the ocean. The primordial waters are divided and assigned to regions above and below the earth. These descriptions cannot be accurate accounts of plate tectonics. The Sumerians had no knowledge of such processes, no ability to measure ocean depths beyond shallow coastal waters, no framework for understanding geological timescales. What they did have was awareness of depth as a category. They dug wells and knew that water could be found at different levels beneath the surface. They dredged rivers and understood that channels deepened as one moved away from source toward mouth. They travelled to the Persian Gulf and observed that coastal shallows gave way to deeper waters beyond sight of land. They extrapolated from these observations to cosmic scale, imagining that depth continues beyond measurement, that the Abzu beneath the earth mirrors the vast sky above, and that between these infinite reaches lies the thin habitable layer where human life occurs. This cosmological intuition that humans occupy a middle zone between abysses above and below corresponds to one aspect of physical reality. Earth's atmosphere extends upward about 60 miles before space begins. The ocean trenches extend downward about 7 miles. Between these outer boundaries lies the zone of active life, the thin shell where temperature and pressure remain within biological tolerance. The Sumerians lacked precise measurements, but their basic intuition was correct. Humanity exists in a narrow band between extremes. Where their cosmology diverges from modern geology is in attribution of agency. Plate tectonics is a mechanical process with no intentionality. Continental drift occurs because convection currents in the mantle drive plate motion, not because gods arrange the structure deliberately. Ocean trenches form where plates collide based on density differentials and force vectors, not because the remnants of a defeated goddess were positioned there to serve architectural purposes. Yet the functional result is oddly similar. Both the Mesopotamian cosmology and modern geology describe a layered structure. Both place the deepest waters in specific locations rather than distributing depth uniformly. Both recognize that Earth's surface contains regions of extreme depth adjacent to regions of relative shallowness. Both understand that these deep places represent something different from the accessible surface, regions subject to different rules, containing different conditions, fundamentally separate from the zones where human experience normally occurs. The question is not whether the Sumerian cosmology is literally accurate, clearly it is not, but whether it represents a valid way of thinking about planetary structure. Does understanding Earth's depths as primordial, as related to the moment of creation, as containing forces that predate current order, illuminate anything true? From one perspective, the answer is yes. The mantle beneath the tectonic plates is indeed primordial. It represents material present since Earth's formation 4.5 billion years ago. The heat that drives plate motion comes from radioactive decay of elements incorporated into the planet during its accretion from the solar nebula. The deepest trenches are places where this primordial interior comes closest to the surface, where the ancient heat and pressure of Earth's formation remain geologically active. In that sense, the depths do remember. They preserve conditions from the planet's early history, conditions that surface processes have long since modified beyond recognition. The Sumerians could not have known this through any empirical method available to them, but their cosmology, which places primordial chaos in the depths and sees current order as a structure imposed atop that chaos, contains metaphorical truth. Earth is not stable. The surface appears solid, but beneath it, convection and subduction and volcanic activity continue to reshape the planet. The depths are not dead, but active, not inert, but dynamic. The architecture of continents and ocean basins is temporary, maintained only as long as current patterns of plate motion continue. Change the pattern, and the entire surface reorganizes. Over geological time, continents have repeatedly assembled into supercontinents and then fragmented. Pangaea, the most recent supercontinent, existed 300 million years ago and has since broken into the current configuration of continents. Before Pangaea came other supercontinents, Rodinia, Columbia, Kenoland, each assembling and fragmenting in cycles lasting hundreds of millions of years. The Atlantic Ocean, which now separates Europe and Africa from the Americas, did not exist 200 million years ago. The Himalayas, Earth's highest mountains, did not exist 50 million years ago. The entire surface constantly reorganizes as the depths drive motion from below. In this context, the Mesopotamian idea that current order derives from violent transformation of primordial chaos becomes defensible. Earth's surface is the product of catastrophic processes, asteroid impacts, volcanic supereruptions, ice ages, mass extinctions. Life itself represents the imposition of order on chemistry, the organization of molecules into patterns that can maintain themselves against entropy. Consciousness imposes further order, creating meaning and memory within the flow of physical causation. Civilization represents yet another layer of imposed structure, human organization of the environment to support complexity beyond what raw nature provides. At every level, order is precarious. It requires maintenance. Remove the stabilizing factors, and systems collapse back towards simpler states. The Mesopotamian cosmology, which requires the Anunnaki to continuously maintain boundaries and prevent chaos from breaking through, reflects this reality. The order we experience is not eternal or inevitable, but the temporary result of processes that could stop or reverse. The deepest ocean trenches in this interpretive frame represent what the surface would like to forget, that the planet's structure is contingent, that the boundaries we rely on are provisional, that depth persists beneath every apparent stability. 7 miles down, in the Hadal zones beyond light, beyond almost all life, in pressure that would crush any surface-adapted organism instantly, the planet remains in a state closer to its primordial formation. The rock is younger, heated by proximity to the mantle. The chemistry is different, influenced by hydrothermal vents that pump minerals directly from Earth's interior. The ecology is alien, adapted to conditions incompatible with surface existence. These depths exist not because a goddess was torn in half, but because the physics of plate tectonics creates them. The Sumerians were wrong about mechanism, but they were correct about significance. The deepest places matter. They represent something different from the surface. They contain conditions and forces that predate and could outlast human civilization. They are, in a meaningful sense, primordial. Whether interpreting them as divine remnants or geological processes, the result is the same: awareness that beneath the inhabited world lies another world, deeper and darker and ruled by laws that do not apply to the surface. The Sumerians called this the Abzu, and populated it with gods and monsters. Modern science calls it the Hadal zone, and populates it with extremophile bacteria and unknown species adapted to conditions barely compatible with life. Both interpretations recognize that these depths exist, that they matter, and that they challenge human understanding in fundamental ways. The Mariana Trench descends 7 miles below sea level. The Sumerians believed the Abzu extended downward without limit. Both statements acknowledge the same essential truth. The depths go down farther than we can easily imagine, into regions we cannot casually access, preserving conditions alien to surface experience. Whether we frame this as geology or cosmology, the depths persist. They wait beneath the surface. And they remember what the surface chooses to forget, that order is imposed, not inherent, and that beneath every stability lies potential for transformation. What mainstream scholars say. The academic study of the Enuma Elish began in the 1870s when George Smith identified fragments among the tablets excavated from Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh. Smith's translation, published in 1876, created immediate controversy. The text's parallels to Genesis, creation through divine speech, division of waters, creation of humanity to serve the gods, challenged Victorian assumptions about biblical uniqueness. If the Babylonians had creation stories predating Genesis, what did this imply about revelation and scriptural authority? The scholarly debate that followed largely ignored these theological implications and focused instead on literary analysis, dating, and cultural context. By the early 20th century, the consensus interpretation emerged that would dominate Mesopotamian studies for the next century. The Enuma Elish represents political theology, composed or compiled in the late 2nd millennium BC to justify Babylon's supremacy over older Mesopotamian states. This interpretation rests on several observations. First, Marduk is a latecomer to the Mesopotamian pantheon. Earlier Sumerian texts feature Enlil as king of the gods, with Anak and Enki as senior deities. Marduk appears only rarely in Sumerian sources, and gains prominence only during the Old Babylonian period, around 1800 BC, when Babylon becomes a major political power. The Enuma Elish, in its standard version, dates to several centuries later, likely composed during the Kassite period, when Babylon reasserted cultural authority after political disruption. The text structure supports this interpretation. Tablet 7, which lists Marduk's 50 names and proclaims his supreme authority, reads like liturgical propaganda. Each name represents an aspect of divine power or a function previously attributed to other gods. By consolidating all these attributes under Marduk's identity, the text effectively subordinates the entire pantheon to Babylon's patron deity. This is not subtle theology, but explicit political claim. Babylon's god is supreme, therefore Babylon's authority is supreme. Thorkild Jacobson, in his influential work, The Treasures of Darkness, 1976, argues that the Enuma Elish reflects a specific moment in Mesopotamian political history, the transition from city-state autonomy to territorial empire. Earlier Sumerian theology emphasized the individual patron gods of each city: Enlil in Nippur, Enki in Eridu, Inanna in Uruk. Each city maintained its own cult center, and political power remained decentralized. The rise of Babylon required theological justification for centralizing authority. The Enuma Elish provides this by narrating a cosmic crisis that only Marduk can resolve, thereby establishing his, and by extension Babylon's, permanent supremacy. W.G. Lambert, in Babylonian Creation Myths, 2013, emphasizes the text's liturgical function. The Enuma Elish was recited annually during the Akitu festival, Babylon's New Year celebration. This ritual context suggests the myth's primary purpose was not philosophical cosmology, but performed theology, a communal reinforcement of cosmic order with Babylon at its centre. The recitation reminded participants that their city's patron deity had saved the universe from chaos and deserved eternal gratitude and service. These interpretations do not dismiss the text's cosmological content, but subordinate it to political and ritual functions. The battle with Tiamat, the division of her body, the creation of heaven and earth, all of this serves primarily to establish Marduk's credentials. The cosmology is instrumentalized, deployed to prove a political point rather than to genuinely explain the world's physical structure. This scholarly consensus is well evidenced and intellectually rigorous. The text's late date relative to earlier Mesopotamian traditions, its focus on Marduk despite his absence from older sources, its liturgical use in Babylon's state cult, all support the interpretation of the Enuma Elish as political theology dressed in cosmological garb. However, this interpretation faces certain difficulties that scholars acknowledge but do not fully resolve. First, the cosmological details in the text exceed what would be necessary for simple political allegory. The specific descriptions of Tiamat's division, the measurements and positions of her body parts, the architectural precision of Marduk's construction work, these details serve no obvious political purpose. If the text merely needed to establish Marduk's supremacy, a simpler narrative would suffice. Why include technical specifications unless the cosmology itself matters? Second, the text's relationship to earlier Sumerian creation accounts remains unclear. Sumerian sources describe creation through various mechanisms: divine speech, sexual generation, craftsmanship, emergence from primordial waters. The Enuma Elish's specific motif of creation through combat appears less prominently in earlier Sumerian texts. Where did this motif come from? If the Babylonians invented it for political purposes, why choose this particular framework rather than adapting existing Sumerian models more directly? Third, the text's preservation and transmission suggest it held importance beyond Babylon. Copies have been found at multiple sites, including Assyrian capitals far north of Babylon. The Assyrians adopted the text despite having their own state god, Ashur, and their own political interests distinct from Babylon's. If the Enuma Elish were purely Babylonian propaganda, its appeal to Assyrian scribes is puzzling. This suggests the text contains something portable and valuable beyond its immediate political context. Samuel Noah Kramer, in Sumerian Mythology 1944, argues that many elements of the Enuma Elish derive from earlier Sumerian traditions now lost or surviving only in fragments. The division of primordial waters, the creation of humanity to serve the gods, the flood narrative, all have Sumerian precedents. What the Enuma Elish may represent is not pure Babylonian invention, but a compilation and systematization of older materials arranged to elevate Marduk specifically, but drawing on legitimate cosmological traditions that predate Babylon's rise to power. This more nuanced reading allows for the text to simultaneously function as political propaganda and preserve genuine cosmological thinking. The Babylonian redactors, selected from available traditions, emphasized aspects that supported their agenda and systematized disparate materials into a coherent narrative. But the raw materials, the cosmological concepts about primordial waters, divine combat, and architectural creation may be older than their Babylonian framing. Jean Botreau, in Religion in Ancient Mesopotamia, 2001, emphasizes that Mesopotamian theology always operates on multiple levels simultaneously. A text can be political allegory, ritual script, cosmological explanation, and historical memory all at once. Modern scholars tend to privilege one level of meaning and treat others as secondary, but Mesopotamian audiences may not have made such distinctions. For them, the Enuma Elish's political message and its cosmological content were inseparable. Marduk's supremacy over the gods was the same kind of fact as his division of Tiamat's body. Both were true statements about cosmic order. This creates interpretive difficulty for modern readers trained to distinguish mythology from history, allegory from literal description, politics from metaphysics. We want to know which category the Enuma Elish belongs to. Mesopotamian culture does not provide a clear answer because the categories themselves are anachronistic. The text is mythological history describing political cosmology. It is all these things simultaneously without contradiction from an ancient perspective. The mainstream scholarly position then can be summarized. The Enuma Elish primarily functions as political theology justifying Babylon's supremacy through a mythological narrative of cosmic crisis and divine heroism. This interpretation is well supported by historical context, textual analysis, and comparative study. However, it does not fully account for the text's cosmological specificity, its relationship to earlier traditions, or its cross-cultural appeal. These aspects suggest layers of meaning beyond political propaganda, perhaps preservation of older cosmological thinking, perhaps genuine attempts to explain observed phenomena, perhaps ritual knowledge encoding practical concerns about water management and environmental control. What mainstream scholarship resists is any interpretation that treats the text as historical documentation of actual events, whether natural catastrophes or alien interventions or any other literalist reading. The consensus holds firmly the Enuma Elish is mythology, a cultural product of human imagination serving social and political functions within ancient Mesopotamian society. It tells us much about how the Babylonians thought, what they valued, how they organized their world conceptually. It tells us nothing reliable about the actual formation of Earth's oceans or the origins of the universe. This position is methodologically sound and intellectually honest. It refuses to speculate beyond what evidence warrants. It anchors interpretation in historical context and textual analysis. It represents the best scholarly thinking about the Enuma Elish after more than a century of professional study. The question is whether this methodologically rigorous approach exhausts the text's possible meanings or leaves interpretive space for alternative readings that, while speculative, address aspects the mainstream consensus does not fully explain. The pattern of celestial combat. The motif of a god defeating a chaos monster appears across multiple ancient cultures with remarkable consistency. In Canaanite texts from Ugarit, Baal defeats Yam, the sea god, to establish his kingship. In Egyptian mythology, Ra battles Apep, the serpent of chaos, every night as he journeys through the underworld. In Greek tradition, Zeus defeats Typhon, a monstrous offspring of Gaia, before establishing Olympian order. In Hittite texts, the storm god defeats the serpent Illuyanka. In Vedic literature, Indra slays the dragon Vritra to release the waters. This pattern, young storm god defeats water-associated chaos monster, establishes cosmic order, recurs with sufficient frequency to suggest either independent development based on shared human experience of natural forces or diffusion of a common mythological tradition across cultures. Scholars debate which explanation better accounts for the parallels. The diffusion theory points to the interconnected nature of ancient Near Eastern cultures. Trade routes, diplomatic exchanges, and military conquests facilitated movement of ideas, stories, and religious concepts across linguistic and political boundaries. A myth originating in one culture could be adopted and adapted by neighbours, modified to fit local pantheons and political circumstances, but retaining core narrative structure. The Enuma Elish's battle between Marduk and Tiamat would thus represent a Babylonian version of a widely distributed mythological template. Support for this theory comes from demonstrable cultural exchange. Akkadian texts appear at Ugarit alongside native Canaanite materials. Egyptian and Mesopotamian mythological motifs appear in Hittite texts. Greek mythology incorporates elements recognizably derived from Near Eastern sources. The connections are historical and documented. However, the independent development theory notes that storm versus water conflict reflects universal environmental experience. Every agricultural society depends on rain but fears flood. Every coastal culture benefits from the sea but respects its destructive power. The tension between water as life source and water as annihilating force is not culturally specific but existentially universal. Different cultures might independently develop mythologies that express this tension through divine combat, not because they borrowed from each other, but because they face similar challenges and conceptualize them through similar narrative frames. The scholarly consensus holds both theories partially valid. Some elements clearly diffuse, specific names, particular narrative details, textual borrowings. Other elements likely develop independently from shared human experience. Determining which elements belong to which category requires careful analysis of each case. For our purposes, what matters is not the ultimate origin of the chaos combat motif, but its specific manifestation in Mesopotamian texts, and what this reveals about how the Sumerians and Babylonians thought about creation. Compared to other ancient Near Eastern versions, the Enuma Elish is distinctive in several ways. First, it emphasizes not just the defeat of chaos, but its physical transformation into cosmic architecture. Baal defeats Yam, but does not build the world from his corpse. Zeus defeats Typhon and imprisons him beneath Mount Etna, but the Greek cosmos is not constructed from Typhon's body. The Mesopotamian version uniquely insists that the defeated chaos being becomes the raw material of creation. Tiamat is not banished or imprisoned or destroyed, she is repurposed. This creates a cosmos fundamentally different from those imagined by neighbouring cultures. Order and chaos are not separate realms, but different configurations of the same substance. Chaos is not outside the world, but beneath it, reformed, but not eliminated. Second, the Mesopotamian version specifies engineering details. Marduk measures, calculates, positions. He establishes guards to prevent Tiamat's waters from escaping. He creates corresponding layers above and below. This architectural precision appears less prominently in other chaos combat myths, which tend toward dramatic confrontation and victory without elaborate description of subsequent construction work. The Enuma Elish reads partly as combat narrative and partly as technical manual. Third, the Mesopotamian version integrates the chaos combat with creation of humanity. The Atrahasis epic describes how the gods, exhausted from maintaining the cosmos, create humans to bear the labour burden. This connects divine combat against primordial chaos with ongoing maintenance work against chaos's potential return. Order requires continuous effort. The battle with Tiamat establishes structure, but that structure demands eternal vigilance to maintain. Humanity exists as part of this maintenance system, performing on Earth the same kind of boundary-keeping work the Anunnaki perform cosmically. The question of whether these narrative elements reflect reality in any sense depends on how we understand reality. Obviously, the texts do not describe literal gods literally fighting literal monsters. The Babylonians were not naive. They understood metaphor and allegory, but they may have used mythological language to encode knowledge about actual processes. Consider the relationship between storm and ocean. Meteorologically, the interaction is complex. Tropical storms draw energy from warm ocean water, intensifying as they pass over favourable conditions. The ocean both generates storms and is disrupted by them. Major hurricanes can temporarily alter ocean circulation patterns, mixing deep cold water to the surface. The relationship is genuinely combative in mechanical terms. Atmospheric dynamics versus oceanic stability, each influencing the other in feedback loops that can amplify or diminish disturbance. The Sumerians and Babylonians obviously lacked modern meteorology, but they observed storms. They lived in a region subject to violent weather. They knew that storms came from the Persian Gulf, that they brought both life-giving rain and destructive floods, that they represented power beyond human control. Mythologizing this as divine combat between storm god and ocean goddess provides a framework for thinking about observed phenomena. It is not scientific, but it is not arbitrary. It maps conceptual categories onto real environmental dynamics. Similarly, the division of primordial waters into fresh and salt reflects accurate observation. Fresh water and salt water behave differently, have different sources, serve different purposes. Mesopotamian hydraulic engineering depended on maintaining this distinction, keeping salt water from contaminating irrigation systems, managing river flow to prevent salinization of fields. The cosmological division between Apsu and Tiamat, between the freshwater abyss beneath the earth and the saltwater ocean surrounding it, represents this practical knowledge elevated to mythological principle. None of this means the Enuma Elish describes actual events, but it suggests the text is not arbitrary invention. The cosmology reflects serious thinking about environmental forces, organized through narrative frameworks that make abstract principles memorable and transmissible. The cross-cultural distribution of chaos combat myths suggests humans everywhere need stories that explain how order emerges from disorder, how structure arises from formlessness, how the predictable world of human experience relates to the unpredictable forces that threaten it. Storm versus water provides a particularly powerful narrative frame because the relationship is genuinely antagonistic yet productive. Too much rain floods, too little causes drought. The right amount, properly managed, sustains life. This is not simple, but balanced opposition. A mythological combat captures that dynamic tension. In Sumerian texts, another combat narrative appears alongside Marduk versus Tiamat, Ninurta versus the Ans bird. This myth describes how the giant bird Ans steals the Tablet of Destinies from Enlil, granting An's supreme power over cosmic order. The gods despair until Ninurta, warrior son of Enlil, volunteers to fight. The battle is fierce. An's possession of the tablet makes him nearly invincible. Each weapon Ninurta deploys, An's deflects by commanding it through the tablet's authority. Only through trickery and overwhelming force does Ninurta finally defeat An's, reclaim the tablet, and restore proper order. This narrative introduces a different kind of chaos, not primordial formlessness, but usurpation of authority. An's does not predate order, but threatens to overthrow it through theft of the administrative instrument that maintains cosmic governance. The resolution requires not construction, but recovery and restoration. Order already exists, it merely needs to be defended against disruption. The Lugal E, a Sumerian composition describing Ninurta's exploits, elaborates further. After defeating various monsters and demons that threaten cosmic stability, Ninurta reorganizes the mountain region, directing watercourses and establishing boundaries. The text describes this work in agricultural terms: irrigation, canal digging, allocation of water rights. Ninurta's divine warfare translates directly into environmental management. These parallel narratives suggest chaos in Mesopotamian thought operates on multiple levels. Primordial chaos precedes creation and must be defeated to establish structure. Ongoing chaos threatens to disrupt existing order and must be continuously suppressed. Political chaos undermines social order and requires heroic intervention. Environmental chaos manifests as flood, drought, and crop failure, requiring technological and ritual response. The mythological language remains consistent across these levels: combat between divine heroes and chaos forces, followed by establishment or restoration of order. The combat is never permanently concluded. Monsters return, boundaries erode, floods threaten. The cosmos requires eternal vigilance. This worldview differs starkly from modern assumptions about natural law. We understand physical processes as self-maintaining, gravity operates without divine intervention, chemical reactions follow deterministic principles, planetary motion continues independently of human or divine observation. The Mesopotamian worldview allows for no such autonomy. Order is imposed and must be maintained. The forces of dissolution persist beneath every apparent stability, and only continuous divine effort prevents regression to chaos. Whether this worldview is true depends on the scale of analysis. At human timescales, order does appear fragile. Civilizations collapse. Ecosystems shift. Ice ages come and go. The apparent stability of the Holocene epoch, the 11,000-year period of climate stability that enabled agriculture and civilization, is an anomaly in Earth's history. Most of the planet's past has been less stable, subject to dramatic shifts in temperature, sea level, and habitability. From this perspective, the Mesopotamian insistence that order requires maintenance, that chaos perpetually threatens, and that boundaries must be actively defended contains experiential truth. The question is whether the mythological framework, divine combat, monster slaying, cosmic architecture expresses this truth effectively or obscures it beneath supernatural imagery that prevents genuine understanding. The answer may be that mythology and science serve different functions. Science describes mechanisms. Mythology provides meaning. The Mesopotamian combat myths do not explain how plate tectonics creates ocean trenches, but they express the significance of those depths, their danger, their power, their connection to forces larger than human comprehension. Perhaps both levels of description are necessary. Perhaps understanding requires both mechanism and meaning, both explanation and interpretation. The patterns of celestial combat distribute across cultures because they address a question every human society confronts. How do we understand and relate to forces vastly more powerful than ourselves? The answers vary, but the question remains constant. The depths persist, the storms return, and humans tell stories to make sense of their precarious existence between abysses. The language of destruction. The Akkadian verb used in the Enuma Elish when Marduk divides Tiamat's body is alu, which means to split into three, or more generally to divide. The text states, Aliu Ali Kemani Iptiem, he split her into three like a fish for drying. The simile is specific, not simply cutting, but dividing the way one processes a fish, separating useful portions from unusable remains. This suggests not destruction but butchery, the systematic reduction of a whole into components for specific purposes. Another verb appears in the same passage, baku, meaning to cut through or to sever. This verb denotes precision cutting rather than destructive hacking. The text describes Marduk as cutting through Tiamat's corpse along structural lines, much as a butcher follows an animal's anatomy rather than randomly slashing. The result is two major portions, upper body and lower body, positioned respectively as sky ceiling and earth foundation. The language precision here is notable. Akkadian possesses multiple verbs for different kinds of cutting, breaking and dividing. The text consistently uses terms that imply controlled partition rather than chaotic destruction. Marduk does not shatter Tiamat or pulverize her. He divides her systematically, creating parts that retain structural integrity sufficient to serve architectural functions. This linguistic precision extends to the positioning of the divided body. The text uses verbs of placement, anu to set, to position, kunnu to sturmly, and rumu to overlay, to cover. Each verb denotes deliberate arrangement rather than random distribution. Marduk sets the upper portion of Tiamat's body in place as a covering for the celestial realm. He establishes it firmly so it cannot shift. He overlays it with additional structural elements to ensure containment of the waters above. Similarly, the lower portion is not simply discarded but positioned as foundation. The verb usu means to lay foundation or to establish as base. The text describes Marduk laying Tiamat's lower body as the foundation upon which subsequent creation will rest. This is construction language, borrowed from actual building practice, where builders first establish solid foundation before raising walls and roof. The linguistic analysis reveals something important. The Enuma Elish describes creation using the same vocabulary Mesopotamian builders used to describe actual construction projects. Temple building inscriptions employ identical verbs when describing how kings establish foundations, position walls, and complete roofs. The cosmological text thus presents divine creation as analogous to human construction, not metaphorically but using the same technical vocabulary, suggesting the two processes are understood as fundamentally similar. This creates an interpretive question. Is the text using construction language metaphorically to describe something essentially different from building, or is it claiming that cosmic creation literally operates through the same principles as human architecture? The mainstream scholarly position treats the language as metaphorical. Ancient audiences understood they were reading mythology, not technical documentation. The construction vocabulary makes creation comprehensible by analogy to familiar processes, but no one believed the universe was literally built like a temple, or that Tiamat's body could be measured in cubits. However, some texts blur this distinction. Temple construction in Mesopotamia was understood as religiously significant, recreating on earth the divine patterns established at creation. When a king built a temple, he was not simply constructing a building, but participating in the original creative act, extending divine order into the human realm. The construction language in cosmological texts and the religious significance of actual construction reinforce each other, creating a conceptual loop where cosmology and architecture mirror each other. Moreover, Mesopotamian texts sometimes describe cosmological features with measurements. The Sumerian composition, the Bartan cylinder, provides dimensions for the cosmic house of Enlil. Other texts specify the height of heaven above earth, variously given as 300 leagues or other large round numbers. These measurements are clearly not empirical. No one measured the height of heaven, but they demonstrate a concern with quantification, an impulse to treat cosmic structure as something that could in principle be measured and specified. The linguistic evidence suggests the Mesopotamians thought seriously about cosmic architecture as something possessing actual structure, not merely symbolic significance. The question of whether they believed this literally or figuratively may be unanswerable, because the distinction between literal and figurative did not operate for them as it does for modern readers. The cosmos was structured like a building. A temple was structured like the cosmos. The two statements were mutually reinforcing, neither subordinate to the other. In the specific context of Tiamat's division, the language emphasizes directionality, upper versus lower, above versus below. The Akkadian term el-bov contrasts with apple, below, lower. These spatial markers structure the entire cosmology. The celestial waters are above, the subterranean waters are below. Between them lies the inhabitable world. This vertical stratification appears consistently across Mesopotamian texts, suggesting it represented a stable conceptual framework shared across centuries. The division of Tiamat's body establishes this vertical structure. Before division, the primordial waters mixed without distinction. After division, they separate into assigned realms. The upper portion becomes the reservoir of celestial waters, the source of rain. The lower portion becomes the foundation of the earth and the source of the Apsu, the subterranean ocean. Between them, suspended in the middle, the dry land appears as the zone of life. Linguistically, this spatial arrangement reflects Mesopotamian understanding of their environment. They lived on floodplains, constantly aware of water above and below spring. The vertical cosmology mirrors this vertical environmental experience. The sky is above and occasionally releases water. The ground is below and occasionally releases water. Between these two water sources, humans must maintain livable space. The destructive power of these water sources required respect. When rain is excessive, fields flood. When groundwater rises too high, soil becomes waterlogged and crops fail. When both sources activate simultaneously, heavy rain plus rising groundwater, catastrophic flooding results. The Mesopotamian myth of the Great Flood describes precisely this scenario. The celestial gates open above, and the Apsu breaks through from below, drowning the middle zone where humans live. The language of division thus represents more than cosmological speculation. It encodes hydraulic engineering principles, keep water sources separated, control their flow into inhabited zones, prevent uncontrolled mixing. The mythological narrative about dividing Tiamat's body translates into practical knowledge about managing water in a challenging environment. Another linguistic element worth examining is the naming of the divided portions. The upper body becomes Am, a term deriving from the root and meaning to be high or to be exalted. The lower body becomes Eratu, from the root Eru, meaning to desire or to wish for, possibly indicating earth as the desired place, the goal of creation. The linguistic roots suggest that even basic cosmological terms carry evaluative and functional connotations, not merely descriptive ones. The precision of this language challenges simplistic readings of Mesopotamian mythology as primitive fancy. The texts demonstrate sophisticated linguistic tools, careful distinctions, and systematic thinking about spatial relationships and structural requirements. Whether the content of that thinking corresponds to physical reality is a separate question from whether the thinking itself is rigorous. By linguistic standards, the Enuma Elish represents serious cosmology, using available conceptual tools to describe cosmic structure in terms that make sense within the culture's broader knowledge framework. Modern readers might dismiss this as pre-scientific superstition, inferior to contemporary physics and astronomy, but the comparison is anachronistic. The relevant question is whether the Mesopotamian cosmology represents sophisticated thinking given the evidence available to its creators. By that standard, the answer is yes. They observed their environment carefully, developed terminology to describe what they saw, systematized their observations into coherent frameworks, and transmitted this knowledge through precisely composed texts that preserve distinctions and relationships across generations. The language of destruction, or more accurately, the language of division and construction, reveals a culture thinking seriously about how order emerges from chaos, how structure derives from raw material, and how boundaries must be established and maintained to create inhabitable space. Whether their specific answers are correct matters less than recognizing they were asking the right questions. What is the structure of the world? How did it come to be? What keeps it stable? What threatens its dissolution? These are still the questions cosmology asks. The language and framework have changed, but the underlying inquiry persists. The Mesopotamians answered with gods and monsters and cosmic architecture. Modern science answers with quantum fields and relativistic space-time and thermodynamic gradients. Both approaches attempt to satisfy the same human need, to understand the structure of reality and our place within it. The language of the Enuma Elish, analysed linguistically, reveals that the Mesopotamians brought to this question the full resources of their intellectual tradition. They thought carefully about the words they used. They distinguished different types of division, different modes of positioning, different qualities of structural stability. Their answer may not be our answer, but it was a serious answer from serious thinkers confronting the mystery of cosmic order with the conceptual tools available to them. In the deep places where Tiamat's lower body lies, the text suggests the primordial chaos remains in a modified state, divided but not destroyed, positioned but not eliminated, foundational but dangerous. The language describes this with precision: contained, not conquered; architecture, not annihilation; a structure that must be maintained because what lies beneath it has not been fully resolved. Perhaps that is the text's deepest insight, that beneath every order lies the potential for disorder, that creation is provisional rather than final, and that the deepest places remember what the surface prefers to forget. Between memory and metaphor, the question of whether mythological narratives preserve any historical content has divided scholars since the 19th century, when archaeologists first began excavating Near Eastern sites and recovering texts that paralleled biblical narratives. Early researchers, many of whom were trained in biblical studies, initially treated discoveries like the Gilgamesh flood story as confirmation of biblical accuracy. If the Babylonians also remembered a flood, then perhaps the flood was a real event, preserved in multiple cultural traditions. This naive concordance gave way to more sophisticated analysis. Scholars recognized that mythological traditions do not preserve historical details with journalistic accuracy. Memory transforms events, combines separate incidents into composite narratives, and embeds historical kernels within layers of symbolic elaboration. The task became distinguishing historical core from mythological elaboration, a task that has proven more difficult and controversial than originally anticipated. One approach draws on catastrophism in geology and archaeology. The uniformitarian assumption that has dominated earth sciences since the 19th century holds that geological processes operate at relatively constant rates, with current observations providing the key to understanding past processes. But catastrophism argues that sudden, violent events, asteroid impacts, volcanic supereruptions, tsunamis, earthquakes, play crucial roles in shaping Earth's surface and human history. The evidence for catastrophism has accumulated significantly since the 1980 asteroid impact theory revolutionized understanding of the Cretaceous-Paleocene extinction. If a 6-mile-wide asteroid could exterminate the dinosaurs 66 million years ago, what other catastrophes might have affected Earth more recently during the period when humans were present to remember them? The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis proposes that around 10,800 BC, a comet or asteroid fragment struck North America, triggering rapid climate change, megafaunal extinctions, and disruption of human populations. The evidence remains contested, but sediment layers from this period show anomalous concentrations of platinum, microscopic diamonds, and other materials consistent with impact. If a catastrophic event occurred during the late Pleistocene, when human populations existed across the northern hemisphere, collective memory of the catastrophe might have entered mythological traditions worldwide. Flood myths appear in many cultures: Mesopotamian, Hebrew, Greek, Indian, Chinese, Australian Aboriginal, Native American. The global distribution has led some researchers to propose that these narratives preserve memory of actual flooding events, perhaps at the end of the last ice age, when glaciers melted and sea levels rose approximately 400 feet. Coastal human populations would have experienced this as catastrophic inundation, forcing retreat inland and creating trauma sufficient to enter long-term cultural memory. The problem with this hypothesis is temporal scale. Post-glacial sea level rise occurred over thousands of years, not the days and weeks described in flood myths. No single generation experienced more than incremental change. The catastrophe was slow motion from human perspective, even if rapid by geological standards. For sea level rise to enter oral tradition as sudden catastrophic flood requires either compression of multi-generational experience into a single narrative or reference to specific localized events, tsunami, storm surge, glacial lake outburst, rather than global sea level change. Recent geological research has identified several candidates for catastrophic regional floods in the Mediterranean and Near East. The Black Sea Deluge hypothesis, proposed by Walter Pittman and William Ryan in 1997, suggests that around 5600 BC, the Mediterranean Sea breached the Bosporus barrier and flooded into the Black Sea basin, which had been a lower elevation freshwater lake. The flooding would have inundated thousands of square miles of inhabited shoreline, forcing populations to flee and potentially creating cultural memory preserved in later flood myths. This hypothesis generates controversy. Subsequent geological surveys of the Black Sea floor produce conflicting evidence. Some cores support sudden flooding, others suggest gradual sea level rise. The dating remains uncertain, with estimates varying by several centuries, and the connection to Mesopotamian flood narratives requires demonstrating cultural transmission from Black Sea region populations to Sumer across significant geographical distance and time depth. Nevertheless, the hypothesis illustrates how mythological narratives might preserve distorted memories of actual catastrophes. A population experiencing sudden flood would naturally incorporate the event into origin narratives, explaining their current location as a result of forced migration. Over generations, the narrative would elaborate mythologically, adding divine characters and moral frameworks, but retaining the core memory of water-driven displacement. Applied to the Mesopotamian flood narratives, this approach suggests looking not for a global deluge, but for regionally significant flooding that affected early Mesopotamian populations severely enough to create lasting cultural trauma. The archaeological evidence from Mesopotamian sites shows flood deposits, but at different chronological levels, indicating multiple separate events rather than a single universal catastrophe. This is consistent with the Tigris-Euphrates river system, which is prone to catastrophic flooding under certain meteorological conditions. The most severe floods in modern Iraqi history have killed tens of thousands of people and destroyed entire cities. A pre-literate population dependent on riverine agriculture would be even more vulnerable. A particularly severe flood that destroyed multiple settlements could easily be remembered as civilization ending. From the perspective of survivors who knew only their local region and had no knowledge of unaffected populations elsewhere, the Sumerian king list's treatment of the flood supports this interpretation. The text lists antediluvian cities, Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak Sipar, Shuruppak, that were destroyed. After the flood, kingship resumes in Kish, a different location. This suggests population displacement, not total extinction. The flood destroyed one cultural political centre, and civilization reconstituted itself elsewhere with partial continuity. If the flood narratives preserve memory of actual catastrophe, do the creation narratives preserve anything comparable? The Enuma Elish's description of cosmic battle and bodily division seems far more mythological, further removed from potential historical events. Yet some elements warrant consideration. The emphasis on separating primordial waters matches a genuine environmental challenge. Early Mesopotamian civilization required massive irrigation infrastructure to separate fresh water from brackish, to drain swamps, to control flooding. The creation narrative, which depicts gods dividing waters and establishing boundaries, could represent mythologized memory of the actual hydraulic engineering that made civilization possible. The battle becomes the struggle to impose agricultural order on a challenging hydrological environment. Tiamat's defeat represents the success of that struggle. Her body becomes the transformed landscape, drained swamps, channeled rivers, irrigated fields. This interpretation treats the mythological language as encoding practical knowledge rather than historical events. The text preserves not memory of actual divine combat, but memory of technological achievement, expressed in terms the culture found meaningful. The deep cosmological structure, layers of water with inhabitable space between, mirrors the engineered structure of Mesopotamian farmland, where proper water management requires maintaining boundaries between different water sources at different elevations. Other elements resist easy historical explanation. The texts focus on depth, on places where primordial waters remain below the Earth's surface, suggests awareness of groundwater and aquifer systems. Mesopotamians dug wells and knew that water existed beneath the surface at various depths. They understood that this underground water connected to surface water sources through mechanisms they could not observe directly. The Abzu, as subterranean ocean, represents this knowledge extended to cosmological scale, but the specific connection to ocean trenches, the deepest places on Earth's surface, requires more speculative interpretation. The Mesopotamians had limited knowledge of the open ocean. The Persian Gulf provided some maritime experience, but deep sea exploration did not exist. How would they know about ocean depths extending miles below sea level? One possibility is that they did not know specifically, but extrapolated correctly from limited evidence. They knew wells could be dug to different depths. They knew some springs emerged from very deep sources. They understood that depth continues beyond what humans can easily access. Their cosmology projects this insight to ultimate scale. If depth continues beyond measurement, then somewhere it reaches profundity beyond human comprehension, what we would now identify as ocean trenches, but what they conceptualized as the primordial abyss. Another possibility is that the cosmological depth represents not physical measurement, but mythological significance. The deepest places are where primordial powers reside, not because those places are physically deepest, but because depth symbolizes antiquity, power, and danger. The Abzu is deep because it is primordial. Tiamat's remains lie in the abyss because she represents chaos that predates order. The physical depth and mythological significance collapse into each other, creating narratives where cosmological structure expresses metaphysical principles through spatial relationships. This interpretive approach acknowledges the sophistication of Mesopotamian thought while recognizing its differences from modern scientific method. They were not measuring ocean depths with sonar, but thinking seriously about hierarchical structure, about relationships between surface and depth, about the past's relationship to the present, about forces that predate civilization and could outlast it. The mythological framework expresses these concerns in narrative form, using available evidence about environmental dynamics and extrapolating to cosmic scale. Whether this preservation of environmental and technological knowledge counts as historical memory depends on how we define the term. If we require specific event documentation, dates, locations, identifiable actors, then Mesopotamian creation myths fail the test. But if we allow for encoding of accumulated knowledge about environmental forces, technological achievements, and existential challenges, then the texts do preserve something real, however transformed through mythological elaboration. The truth likely lies between naive literalism and dismissive skepticism. The texts are not journalistic accounts of actual events, but neither are they arbitrary fantasies. They represent serious attempts to explain observed phenomena using available conceptual frameworks. They encode genuine knowledge about hydraulic engineering, environmental dynamics, and the precariousness of civilized order. They preserve cultural memory of challenges overcome and disasters endured, even if the specific details are elaborated beyond recognition. The question of whether Sumerian texts contain any historical memory of Earth's ocean formation obviously exceeds what evidence can support, but the question of whether they contain sophisticated thinking about depth, boundaries, chaos, and order admits a positive answer. The texts demonstrate that the Mesopotamians thought seriously about the structure of their world and developed complex narratives to express that thinking. Whether those narratives preserve distorted memories of catastrophes, encode practical knowledge in mythological form, or represent pure imaginative theology remains debated. Perhaps they accomplish all three simultaneously, operating on multiple levels that ancient audiences distinguish differently than we do. Between memory and metaphor lies a space where knowledge takes narrative form, where observed patterns become divine actors, where human experience projects to cosmic scale. The Mesopotamian creation myths occupy that space, neither purely historical nor purely fictional, but something more complex, the product of sophisticated minds working to understand reality using tools different from modern science, but no less serious in their application. The inheritance of knowledge. The Sumerians appear in the archaeological records suddenly, around 3500 BCE, with fully developed cities, complex administrative systems, advanced architecture and writing. This rapid emergence has puzzled scholars for more than a century. Most civilizations show gradual development from simpler forms, but the Sumerians seem to arrive complete, raising questions about where their cultural sophistication came from. The preceding Ubaid period, from approximately 6500 to 3800 BCE, shows continuous occupation of southern Mesopotamia with steadily increasing settlement size and complexity. Ubaid pottery appears across a wide region, suggesting either trade networks or cultural uniformity. Temple structures from the Ubaid period at Eridu demonstrate religious architecture and planning. The Ubaid clearly represents an advanced culture, but the transition to Sumerian civilization involves qualitative changes, writing, monumental architecture, bureaucratic state organization that seem disproportionate to the chronological gap. Three explanations have been proposed. First, the sudden appearance is illusory, an artifact of incomplete archaeological evidence. The key developments occurred during the late Ubaid and Uruk periods, but preservation bias means we recover only the most durable examples, the monumental structures and baked clay tablets, rather than the wooden buildings and perishable records that preceded them. As excavation continues, the apparent discontinuity will resolve into gradual development. Second, external influence catalyzed rapid development. A new population migrated into southern Mesopotamia, bringing cultural innovations that combined with indigenous Ubaid traditions to produce Sumerian civilization. The migrant group's identity remains debated. Proposed candidates include populations from the Iranian plateau, the Caucasus, or even more distant regions. Linguistic evidence suggests Sumerian is a language isolate, unrelated to neighbouring Semitic, Indo-European, or other known language families, supporting the migration hypothesis. Third, the development was internal but accelerated by specific technological and social innovations whose effects multiplied rapidly. Writing enabled administrative complexity previously impossible. Bronze metallurgy provided tools superior to stone. Irrigation agriculture generated surplus, supporting specialised labour. Political centralisation created economies of scale. These innovations, appearing roughly simultaneously, produced sudden transformation from village culture to urban civilization. Modern scholarship generally favours a combination of these explanations, acknowledging both continuity with Ubaid culture and accelerated change during the Uruk period, with possible minor contributions from migrant populations. The debate continues because evidence remains incomplete and interpretations vary. What matters for our purposes is the question these debates raise. Did the Sumerians invent their civilization or inherit it? If they inherited elements from a previous culture, how much of their mythology and cosmology represents indigenous creation versus transmission of older traditions? The Sumerian texts themselves sometimes gesture toward an even earlier period. The king list places civilization's origin when kingship was lowered from heaven, suggesting divine rather than human origin. The city of Eridu, consistently identified as the first city, is called the city of the first king. The temple at Eridu, dedicated to Enki, shows architectural continuity extending back to the Ubaid period, indicating that the site's religious significance predates Sumerian civilization proper. Some Sumerian texts describe Enki bringing the fundamental elements of civilization, from the Abzu and distributing them to cities. This narrative implies that civilization's components existed prior to their human implementation, stored in the deep waters until Enki retrieved and deployed them. Whether this represents mythologized memory of technological diffusion, theological explanation of cultural origins, or preservation of even older traditions cannot be determined from textual evidence alone. The concept of knowledge as inherited rather than invented appears repeatedly in Mesopotamian sources. The sage tradition, most fully developed in later Assyrian texts, identifies 7 antediluvian Arkalu, sages who lived before the flood and established civilized arts. The most famous, Adapa, receives wisdom directly from Enki and serves as humanity's culture bringer. After the flood, these sages exist only as memory, their knowledge preserved imperfectly in human tradition. The post-flood world represents declined state relative to antediluvian sophistication. This narrative of lost golden age appears cross-culturally. Greek myths of successive ages declining from gold to silver to bronze to iron, biblical narratives of Edenic perfection followed by fallen state, Hindu concepts of declining yugas. Whether these narratives reflect historical reality, actual civilizational collapse, leaving only fragmentary memory, or represent universal psychological patterns, idealization of the past, projection of perfection into inaccessible origin, remains debated. Archaeological evidence provides limited support for the collapse interpretation. The end of the last ice age, around 9700 BC, marks dramatic climate change that would have affected human populations globally. The Younger Dryas Cold Period, 10,800–9,700 BC, shows rapid temperature fluctuations that could have disrupted established communities. If complex societies existed during the Ice Age and collapsed during this climatic instability, subsequent populations might preserve garbled memory of lost sophistication. However, the archaeological evidence for pre-Holocene complex society is thin. Sites like Bekli Tepe in Turkey, dated to 9600 BC, demonstrate surprisingly advanced architecture and social organisation for hunter-gatherer populations, but they do not indicate full civilization comparable to Sumer. The monuments are impressive, but lack cities, writing, or complex state structures. They suggest greater pre-agricultural social complexity than previously assumed, but not lost advanced civilization. The mainstream scholarly position holds that civilization developed during the Holocene after 10,000 BC, taking advantage of climate stability to develop agriculture, which generated surplus enabling specialization and social complexity. Pre-agricultural populations possessed sophisticated knowledge of their environments and created impressive monuments, but they did not develop full civilization. The Sumerian mythology of inherited wisdom represents not historical memory, but theological principle. Knowledge derives ultimately from divine sources, not human invention. Yet the question persists: why would the Sumerians, living at the beginning of recorded history, describe themselves as inheritors rather than inventors? If they were in fact the first civilization, why frame their achievements as recovery or restoration of what existed before? One answer is religious humility. Attributing knowledge to divine sources rather than human ingenuity honours the gods and acknowledges human dependence. This is theologically conventional and need not reflect historical reality. The Sumerians invented but claimed to inherit, because inheritance from gods was more culturally acceptable than human innovation. Another answer is that invention as a concept had different meaning in ancient cultures. Modern Western thought valorizes originality and innovation. Ancient cultures often valued tradition and transmission more highly. The best claim was not "I invented this," but "I received this from my teachers, who received it from their teachers, extending back to the origin." The Sumerian claim to inherit rather than invent thus reflects cultural values about knowledge legitimacy rather than historical facts about origins. But a third possibility is that the Sumerians did inherit significant knowledge from predecessor cultures whose identity and achievements are now obscure. The Ubaid culture, spanning 2 millennia before Sumerian civilization proper, had time to develop sophisticated knowledge about irrigation, architecture, astronomy, and other domains. When Sumerian culture emerged from Ubaid roots, it naturally viewed itself as continuing and elaborating established traditions rather than creating ex nihilo. The cosmological texts might preserve knowledge developed during the Ubaid period, or even earlier. Observations about hydrology, weather patterns, seasonal cycles, these could accumulate over generations, eventually systematized into cosmological frameworks. The texts attribute this knowledge to divine sources or antediluvian sages, because transmission was oral for so long that human originators were forgotten, leaving only tradition without specific authors. This interpretation treats the Sumerian claim to inherited knowledge as accurate in essence, if not in detail. They did inherit rather than invent. They inherited from forgotten human predecessors whose achievements entered tradition as divine revelation, because the historical transmission chain was lost. The question ultimately cannot be resolved with available evidence. The gap between Ubaid and Sumerian culture is significant, but not impossible to explain through ordinary developmental processes. The sophistication of Sumerian cosmology could represent either indigenous creation during the Uruk period or inheritance from earlier traditions. The texts themselves claim inheritance, but texts are not transparent windows into historical reality. What is clear is that the Sumerians thought about inheritance seriously. Their creation myths emphasized not virgin creation, but reorganization of pre-existing materials. Marduk does not create Tiamat, but defeats and repurposes her. Enki does not invent the ME, but retrieves them from the Abzu. Kingship is not invented by humans, but lowered from heaven. At every level, the texts describe derivation from prior sources rather than spontaneous generation. This consistent emphasis on inheritance over invention suggests a cultural framework that valued continuity with the past. Whether that past was real, an actual predecessor culture possessing knowledge the Sumerians received and elaborated, or constructed, a mythological past created to explain and legitimize present practices, the framework remains the same. Knowledge comes from sources older and more authoritative than contemporary humans. The task is not creation, but faithful transmission and proper application. For the question of ocean depths and creation narratives, this framework suggests the texts should be read not as Sumerian invention, but as Sumerian preservation. Whether they preserved accurate knowledge about planetary formation obviously seems unlikely, but whether they preserved sophisticated thinking about environmental forces, developed over generations of observation, and systematized into coherent cosmological frameworks seems more plausible. The depths in the texts represent the deep past, the primordial state that precedes and underlies current order. They are described as real places with real properties because they represent real knowledge about water, depth, and the limits of human access. The mythological elaboration, Tiamat's body, the Anunnaki's labour, Marduk's architecture, expresses this knowledge in terms the culture found meaningful, but the underlying concern is genuine, understanding the structure of the world and humanity's place within it. Whether the Sumerians invented this understanding or inherited it from predecessors, they transmitted it to successors. The Babylonians received it from Sumer, the Assyrians from Babylon, the Persians from both. Elements entered biblical tradition, Greek philosophy, and eventually modern scholarship. The transmission chain, however transformed, extends 4 millennia. Somewhere in that chain lies the original observation that depth exists, that it matters, and that beneath every apparent order lies something deeper and older waiting. What the tablets cannot tell us. The fragment catalogue number CBS 10673 preserves roughly 1/3 of its original content. The rest is lost, broken away in antiquity, the clay either dissolved or still buried somewhere in the ruins of Nippur. What we can read describes creation, cities, rulers, and the beginning of a flood narrative. What we cannot read might contain crucial details that would clarify the text's meaning, resolve ambiguities, or even contradict current interpretations. This is the fundamental limitation of ancient textual studies. We work with fragments. Even the most complete tablets show damage. Multiple manuscripts exist for major compositions like the Enuma Elish, allowing scholars to reconstruct missing sections by comparing versions, but this introduces its own problems. Different manuscripts show variations, scribal errors, regional differences, intentional editing. Reconstructions are educated guesses, not certainties. Every translation is interpretation, every restored gap is hypothesis. The cuneiform writing system adds further complexity. Sumerian uses logograms and syllabic signs interchangeably, creating ambiguity about proper readings. The same sign can represent different words or syllables depending on context. Without vowels marked consistently, pronunciation must be inferred. Later copyists sometimes misunderstood earlier texts, correcting what they perceived as errors and thereby altering meaning. The text we read today represents transmission through multiple copying generations, each introducing potential errors. For the Enuma Elish specifically, the standard version derives from manuscripts dating to the first millennium BC, copying a composition likely created centuries earlier. The oldest fragments date to approximately 1500 BC, but the composition may be older. We cannot know how much the text changed during transmission from hypothetical original to surviving manuscripts. Babylonian scribes were conservative, copying texts faithfully across generations, but they also updated language, corrected perceived errors, and sometimes combined variant traditions. The text we possess represents one tradition among potentially multiple versions. The cosmological details most relevant to our inquiry, Tiamat's division, the positioning of her body, the establishment of depths, appear in tablets 4 and 5. These sections survive in multiple manuscripts with reasonable consistency, giving confidence that major elements are correctly understood, but subtle details remain unclear. The exact positioning of Tiamat's lower body, the relationship between her remains and the Abzu, the mechanisms by which her division creates the ocean depths, these emerge from interpretation of fragmentary and sometimes ambiguous passages. Scholarly translations differ significantly. Some render key phrases as clearly architectural, emphasizing construction imagery. Others translate more abstractly, downplaying physical specificity. The differences often turn on single word choices or grammatical constructions that admit multiple readings. No translation is neutral. Each reflects the translator's understanding of the text's genre, purpose, and relationship to other ancient Near Eastern materials. The interpretive framework scholars bring to texts shapes conclusions drawn from them. Those who view the Enuma Elish primarily as political theology emphasize elements supporting that reading. Those interested in cosmological speculation emphasize different elements. Those seeking historical memory look for details that might correspond to events. These approaches are not mutually exclusive, but they guide attention toward different aspects and influence how ambiguous passages are resolved. The text cannot tell us what the authors actually believed. Did the Babylonian scribe who copied K 3473 believe Marduk literally split Tiamat's body? Did he understand the narrative as metaphorical, as historical report, as liturgical drama, as some category modern readers lack? Ancient texts do not come with interpretive keys explaining how contemporary audiences understood them. We observe practices, the text was copied repeatedly, recited publicly, treated as authoritative, but cannot access beliefs directly. The gap between text and belief affects how we evaluate mythological narratives. Modern readers tend to assume myths are believed in differently than historical accounts or scientific descriptions, but this assumption reflects modern epistemology, not necessarily ancient categories. The Mesopotamians may not have divided knowledge into mythological versus factual the way contemporary culture does. A text could simultaneously be theological allegory, political propaganda, cosmological explanation, and historical memory without contradiction from an ancient perspective. This creates interpretive humility. We can determine what the texts say with reasonable accuracy. We cannot determine what they meant with certainty. We can propose interpretations, support them with evidence, argue their plausibility. We cannot claim definitive knowledge of ancient intentionality or belief. For the specific question of whether Sumerian texts describe actual ocean formation, the tablets themselves are agnostic. They describe cosmological processes using available conceptual vocabulary. They attribute agency to divine actors. They provide specific details about division and positioning, but they do not explain their own epistemological status. They do not clarify whether readers should understand these descriptions as literal accounts, symbolic representations, or some other category. Three broad interpretive frameworks emerge from scholarly analysis, each with evidentiary support and theoretical challenges. Framework 1. Pure mythology. This interpretation treats the texts as imaginative theological constructions with no historical referent beyond the culture that produced them. The Enuma Elish explains divine hierarchy and justifies Babylon's political supremacy through mythological narrative. The cosmological elements serve these purposes but do not attempt to describe actual planetary formation. The depths, the division, the primordial combat, all are literary devices, meaningful within the symbolic system, but not intended as natural history. This framework aligns with mainstream scholarly consensus and respects the text's religious and political functions. Its limitation is that it may overdetermine meaning, reading all cosmological content as subordinate to political agenda and thereby missing elements that exceed that function. Framework 2, encoded knowledge. This interpretation treats mythological language as encoding practical knowledge about environmental forces, technological achievements, and observable phenomena. The battle between storm god and ocean goddess represents actual meteorological dynamics. The division of primordial waters represents hydraulic engineering achievements. The layered cosmology represents empirical knowledge about groundwater and atmospheric water sources. The narrative form makes knowledge memorable and transmissible across generations before writing was fully developed. This framework respects the text's sophistication and acknowledges they may contain more than political allegory. Its limitation is that it risks over-interpreting, finding encoded knowledge in elements that may be purely symbolic. Framework 3, preserved memory. This interpretation treats the texts as containing distorted memory of actual catastrophic events, floods, impacts, climate disruptions that affected early human populations severely enough to enter cultural tradition. The flood narratives preserve memory of real flooding. The creation narratives preserve memory of dramatic environmental transformations. The primordial combat preserves memory of forces experienced as divine conflict. Over generations, these memories elaborate mythologically, but historical kernels persist within symbolic elaboration. This framework takes seriously the possibility that oral tradition can preserve information across long periods. Its limitation is evidentiary, demonstrating that mythological narratives contain historical memory is methodologically difficult and risks confirming pre-existing beliefs rather than following evidence. These frameworks are not mutually exclusive. A single text can simultaneously function as political theology, encode practical knowledge, and preserve fragmentary memory. The question is which framework or combination best explains the evidence without overreaching into speculation. The tablets cannot tell us which interpretation is correct. They preserve narratives that admit multiple readings. Each reading finds support in the texts while leaving other elements unexplained or requiring auxiliary hypotheses. This is not a weakness of the texts, but a feature of human meaning-making. Texts exceed authorial intention. They mean differently to different audiences. Their significance changes across time. What the original Babylonian scribes intended may differ substantially from what the text came to mean in later traditions, or what they mean to contemporary readers. The question of ocean depths and their creation in ancient texts thus remains open. The Enuma Elish describes division of primordial waters and positioning of portions to create layered cosmos. Whether this description contains any correspondence to actual planetary formation is undecidable from textual evidence alone. Scholars can analyse language, trace parallels, reconstruct historical context, but the gap between mythological narrative and physical reality cannot be bridged by textual analysis alone. It requires interpretive choices about how to relate ancient thought to modern knowledge, choices that involve philosophical assumptions about the nature of knowledge, the reliability of tradition, and the relationship between mythological and scientific descriptions of reality. What the tablets can tell us is that the Mesopotamians thought seriously about creation, structure, order, and chaos. They developed sophisticated conceptual frameworks and expressed them in carefully composed texts transmitted across centuries. These texts demonstrate that the ancients were not naive or primitive, but thoughtful and systematic, working with available evidence to construct comprehensive worldviews. Whether those worldviews correspond to physical reality as modern science describes it is a separate question from whether they represent sophisticated thinking. The fragment CBS 10673 lies in Philadelphia. The Enuma Elish tablets rest in London. The well-Blundell prism occupies a case in Oxford. These clay objects, inscribed thousands of years ago, preserve questions humans still ask. Where did the world come from? What holds it together? What lies beneath the surface? The answers change as knowledge accumulates, but the questions persist, generation after generation, because they address fundamental human concerns about existence and meaning. The tablets cannot tell us everything, but they tell us that the search for understanding is ancient, that the effort to explain reality systematically is not modern innovation but human constant, and that the deepest questions resist easy answers across all cultures and eras. Listening to the silence. Return for a moment to that fragment in the museum vault. Catalogue number K3473. Cold and still in climate-controlled darkness. The wedges pressed into its surface describe a world torn and remade, a cosmos built from violence, depths that remember what the surface forgets. 3,000 years separate that fragment's creation from today. The scribe who pressed those symbols into wet clay is dust. Babylon is ruins. The Tigris has shifted course. But the text persists. Persistence is not the same as clarity. We can read the cuneiform. We can translate the Akkadian into English. We can reconstruct damaged portions from parallel manuscripts. We can situate the text within Mesopotamian history, trace its influence on later traditions, analyse its literary structure, and yet something essential remains elusive: the meaning beneath the words, the intention behind the composition, the relationship between mythological narrative and lived experience. This elusiveness is not failure, but acknowledgement of complexity. Ancient texts are not transparent. They emerge from contexts radically different from our own, encoding assumptions we no longer share, addressing questions we frame differently. The effort to understand them requires not just translation, but interpretation, an act that bridges historical distance through empathy and imagination while remaining tethered to evidence. The Sumerian cosmology of layered depths, of primordial waters divided and constrained, of ongoing maintenance required to prevent chaos's return, this worldview diverges from modern scientific understanding but reflects serious observation of environmental reality. Mesopotamians lived in an unstable region subject to floods, earthquakes, and climate variability. They depended on sophisticated water management for survival. Their cosmology expressed this precariousness through mythological narrative that made existential insecurity comprehensible and manageable. Whether their specific explanations are correct matters less than recognizing they were doing the same work we continue, trying to understand the structure of reality and our place within it. The deepest oceans, whether framed as Tiamat's remains in the Abzu or as Hadal trenches formed by subduction, represent limits of human access, places where the familiar gives way to the alien, where conditions incompatible with ordinary life persist. Modern oceanography has mapped the Mariana Trench, sent submersibles to Challenger Deep, documented the extreme life forms that inhabit crushing darkness. Yet in important ways the depths remain as mysterious now as they were to the Babylonians. We can describe the mechanisms of their formation, we can catalogue their biological inhabitants, we can explain the physics of deep water pressure, but we cannot claim to fully comprehend what it means that such places exist, that beneath the surface world of light and life lies another world, dark and cold and ancient, subject to rules that do not apply above. The Mesopotamian insight was not that gods literally tore apart monsters to create these depths. The insight was that depths exist, that they matter, that they connect to forces beyond immediate human control. This insight translates across epistemological frameworks. Whether we describe those forces as divine or geological, the recognition remains valid. The world contains layers, some accessible and some not, some comprehensible and some less so. The title of this exploration suggested that Sumerian texts reveal how Anunnaki battle created Earth's deepest oceans. The verb reveal is carefully chosen, not prove or demonstrate, but reveal, uncover, make visible, bring to attention. The texts reveal how one culture thought about creation and depth. They reveal a worldview that framed cosmic order as precarious, maintained through effort against persistent chaos. They reveal sophisticated thinking about water, boundaries, and environmental management. They reveal that human beings 4,000 years ago asked the same questions we ask. Where did this come from? What holds it together? What might tear it apart? They do not reveal, in the sense of conclusively demonstrating, that actual divine battles created actual ocean trenches, that reading requires more belief than evidence supports. But they reveal something real nonetheless, that humans have always looked at the depths with wonder and fear, have always recognised that beneath apparent stability lies something deeper and older, and have always sought frameworks, mythological or scientific, to make this recognition bearable. The silence in the question is louder than any answer. We do not know definitively what the ancient texts intend. We do not know what their authors believed. We do not know how much represents historical memory, how much encodes practical knowledge, how much is pure imaginative theology. The texts themselves do not resolve these questions. They present narratives that admit multiple interpretations, and honest scholarship acknowledges this ambiguity rather than forcing premature closure. This is not surrender, but maturity. The impulse to find definitive answers, to resolve all ambiguity, to claim certain knowledge. This is understandable, but often premature. Some questions remain open, not because we lack intelligence or effort, but because evidence does not compel singular conclusions. Multiple interpretations remain viable, each with strengths and weaknesses, none conclusively eliminating alternatives. The question of whether Sumerian cosmology contains any correspondence to actual planetary formation is one such question. We have examined the textual evidence, considered scholarly interpretations, explored geological realities, acknowledged limitations. The result is not certainty, but informed uncertainty, a clearer understanding of what we can know and what remains speculative. What we can know is that the texts exist, that they describe depths and division and cosmic architecture with consistency and sophistication. What remains speculative is whether this description contains any relationship to physical reality beyond metaphor and imagination. Perhaps that is enough. Perhaps the value is not in resolving the question definitively, but in engaging it seriously, in recognizing that ancient texts deserve careful attention, that mythology represents sophisticated thinking even when it differs from modern frameworks, and that the human effort to understand reality transcends particular cultures and historical periods. The fragment lies in the vault. The ocean depths descend beyond light. Between them lies interpretation, our attempt to bridge the distance between ancient text and contemporary understanding, between mythological narrative and scientific description, between what the past said and what it might mean today. If this exploration has resonated with you, if these questions seem worth pursuing further, let me know in the comments. Not because I have definitive answers. The honest response is that definitive answers may not exist, but because the questions themselves matter. They connect us to the deepest human concerns, understanding where we came from, comprehending the structure of the world we inhabit, acknowledging forces larger than ourselves. The Sumerians looked at the depths and saw divine remnants, primordial chaos constrained but not eliminated. We look at the same depths and see tectonic forces, geological processes, extremophile life, adapted to conditions barely compatible with existence. Both perspectives recognise that the depths are real, that they matter, and that they challenge human understanding in fundamental ways. What lies 7 miles down in the Mariana Trench or in the ancient Abzu is not simply water or rock or divine corpse. It is the recognition that beneath every order lies depth, beneath every stability lies older forces, beneath every answer lies deeper questions. The texts cannot tell us everything, but they tell us that wondering about these depths is ancient, that the effort to understand them is serious, and that the mystery persists across all attempts at resolution. Listen to that silence. It speaks.